Notes. Note 1. The power of the Roman law in Germany. The manner in which it had superseded the Germanic law. Towards the end of the Middle Ages the Roman law became the principal and almost the sole study of the German legists. Indeed, at this time, most of them pursued their education out of Germany in the Italian universities. These legists, though not the masters of political society, were charged with the explanation and application of its laws. And though they could not abolish the Germanic law, they altered and disfigured it so as to fit into the frame of the Roman law. They applied the Roman law to everything in the German institutions that seemed to have the most remote analogy with the legislation of Justinian, and they thus introduced a new spirit and new usage into the national legislation. By degrees it was so completely transformed that it was no longer recognizable, and in the 17th century, for instance, it was almost unknown. It had been replaced by a nondescript something, which was German indeed in name, but Roman in fact. I find reason to believe that owing to these efforts of the legists, the condition of ancient Germanic society deteriorated in many respects, especially so far as the peasants were concerned. Many of those who had succeeded until then in preserving the whole or part of their liberties or of their possessions, lost them at this period by learned assimilations of their condition to that of the Roman bondsmen or amphidiotes. This gradual transformation of the national law, and the vain efforts which were made to oppose it, may be clearly traced in the history of Württemberg. From the origin of the county of that name in 1250, until the creation of the duchy in 1495, the legislation was purely indigenous. It was composed of customs and local laws made by the towns or by the courts of seigneury, and of statutes promulgated by the estates. Ecclesiastical affairs alone were regulated by a foreign code, the canon law. From 1495 the character of the legislation was changed, the Roman law began to penetrate. The doctors, as they were called, those who had studied law in the foreign schools, entered the government and possessed themselves of the direction of the superior courts. During the whole of the first half of the 16th century political society maintained the same struggle against them that was going on in England at the same time, but with very different success. At the Diet of Tübingen in 1514, and at those which succeeded it, the representatives of feudalism and the deputies of the towns made all kinds of representations against that which was taking place. They attacked the legists who were invading all the courts, and changing the spirit or the letter of all customs and laws. The advantage at first seemed on their side. They obtained from the government the promise that henceforth the high courts should be composed of honorable and enlightened men chosen from among the nobility and the estates of the duchy, and not of doctors. And that a commission composed of agents of the government, and of representatives of the estates, should draw up the project of a code which might serve as a rule throughout the country. These efforts were vain. The Roman law soon drove the national law out of a great portion of the legislation, and even took root in the very ground on which it still suffered this legislation to subsist. This victory of a foreign over the indigenous law is ascribed by many German historians to two causes: 1. To the movement which at that period attracted all minds towards the languages and literature of antiquity, and the contempt which this inspired for the intellectual productions of the national genius. 2. To the idea which had always possessed the whole of the Middle Ages in Germany, and which displays itself even in the legislation of that period, that the Holy Empire was the continuation of the Roman Empire, and that the legislation of the former was an inheritance derived from the latter. These causes, however, are not sufficient to explain why the same law should at the same period have been introduced into the whole continent of Europe. I believe that this arose from the fact that at this time the absolute power of the sovereigns was everywhere established on the ruins of the ancient liberties of Europe, and that the Roman law, a law of servitude, was admirably fitted to second their views. The Roman law which everywhere perfected civil society tended everywhere to degrade political society, inasmuch as it was chiefly the production of a highly civilized but much enslaved people. The kings of Europe accordingly adopted it with eagerness, and established it wherever they were the masters. Throughout Europe the interpreters of this law became their ministers or their chief agents. When called on to do so the legists even gave them the support of the law against the law itself, and they have frequently done so since. Wherever there was a sovereign who violated the laws, we shall generally find at his side a legist who assured him that nothing was more lawful, and who proved most learnedly that his violence was just, and that the oppressed party was in the wrong. Note 2. The transition from feudal to democratic monarchy. As all monarchies had become absolute about the same period, it is scarcely probable that this change of constitution was owing to any particular circumstance which accidentally occurred at the same time in every state. And we are led to the belief that all these similar and contemporary events must have been produced by some general cause, which simultaneously acted everywhere in the same manner. This general cause was the transition from one state of society to another, from feudal inequality to democratic equality. The nobility was already depressed, and the people were not yet raised. The former were brought too low, and the latter were not sufficiently high to restrain the action of the ruling power. For 150 years kings and princes enjoyed a sort of golden age, during which they possessed at once stability and unlimited power, two things which are usually incompatible. They were as sacred as the hereditary chiefs of a feudal monarchy, and as absolute as the rulers of a democratic society. Note 3. Decay of the free towns of Germany. Imperial towns, Reichsstadt. According to the German historians, the period of the greatest splendor of these towns was during the 14th and 15th centuries. They were then the abode of wealth, of the arts and sciences, masters of the commerce of Europe, the most powerful centers of civilization. In the north and in the south of Germany especially, they had ended by forming independent confederations with the surrounding nobles, as the towns in Switzerland had done with the peasants. In the 16th century they still enjoyed the same prosperity, but the period of their decay was come. The 30 Years' War hastened their fall, and scarcely one of them escaped destruction and ruin during that period. Nevertheless, the Treaty of Westphalia mentions them positively, and asserts their position as immediate states, that is to say, states which depended immediately upon the emperor. But the neighboring sovereigns, on the one hand, and on the other the emperor himself, the exercise of whose power, since the 30 Years' War, was limited to the lesser vassals of the empire, restricted their sovereignty within narrower and narrower limits. In the 18th century 51 of them were still in existence, they filled 2 benches at the Diet, and had an independent vote there, but, in fact, they no longer exercised any influence upon the direction of general affairs. At home they were all heavily burdened with debts, partly because they continued to be charged for the imperial taxes at a rate suited to their former splendor, and partly because their own administration was extremely bad. It is very remarkable that this bad administration seemed to be the result of some secret disease which was common to them all, whatever might be the form of their constitution. Whether aristocratic or democratic, it equally gave rise to complaints, which, if not precisely similar, were equally violent. If aristocratic, the government was said to have become a coterie composed of a few families, everything was done by favor and private interest; if democratic, popular intrigue and venality appeared on every side. In either case there were complaints of the want of honesty and disinterestedness on the part of the governments. The emperor was continually forced to interpose in their affairs, and to try to restore order in them. Their population decreased, and distress prevailed in them. They were no longer the abodes of German civilization, the arts left them, and went to shine in the new towns created by the sovereigns, and representing modern society. Trade forsook them, their ancient energy and patriotic vigor disappeared. Hamburg almost alone still remained a great center of wealth and intelligence, but this was owing to causes quite peculiar to herself. Note 4. Date of the abolition of serfdom in Germany. The following table will show that the abolition of serfdom in most parts of Germany has taken place very recently. Serfdom was abolished. 1. In Baden, in 1783. 2. In Hohenzollern, in 1804. 3. In Schleswig and Holstein, in 1804. 4. In Nassau, in 1808. 5. In Prussia, Frederick William I had done away with serfdom in his own domains so early as 1717. The Code of the Great Frederick, as we have already seen, was intended to abolish it throughout the kingdom, but in reality it only got rid of it in its hardest form, the Leibagenschaft, and retained it in the mitigated shape of Verbunterthanigkeit. It was not till 1809 that it disappeared altogether. 6. In Bavaria serfdom disappeared in 1808. 7. A decree of Napoleon, dated from Madrid in 1808, abolished it in the Grand Duchy of Berg, and in several other small territories, such as Erfurt, Bayreuth, and 8. In the Kingdom of Westphalia, its destruction dates from 1808 and 1809. 9. In the Principality of Lippe-Detmold, from 1809. 10. In Schaumburg-Lippe, from 1810. 11. In Swedish Pomerania, from 1810 also. 12. In Hessen-Darmstadt, from 1809 and 1811. 13. Württemberg, from 1817. 14. In Mecklenburg, from 1820. 15. In Oldenburg, from 1814. 16. In Saxony for Lusatia, from 1832. 17. In Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen, only from 1833. 18. In Austria, from 1811. So early as in 1782 Joseph II had destroyed Leibagenschaft. But serfage in its mitigated form of Verbunterthanigkeit lasted till 1811. Note 5. A part of the countries which are now German, such as Brandenburg, Prussia proper, and Silesia, were originally inhabited by a Slavonic race, and were conquered and partially occupied by Germans. In those countries serfdom had a far harsher aspect than in Germany itself, and left far stronger traces at the end of the 18th century. Note 6. Code of Frederick the Great. Amongst the works of Frederick the Great the least known, even in his own country, and the least brilliant, is the code drawn up under his directions and promulgated by his successor. I do not know, however, whether any of them throws more light upon the man himself and on his time, or which more fully displays their reciprocal influence on each other. This code is a real constitution, in the sense usually attached to the word. It undertakes to define not only the relations of the citizens to one another, but also the relations between the citizens and the state. It is at once a civil code, a criminal code, and a charter. It rests, or appears to rest, on a certain number of general principles expressed in a very philosophical and abstract form, and resembling in many respects those which abound in the Declaration of the Rights of Man in the French Constitution of 1791. It proclaims that the good of the state and of its inhabitants is the object of society and the limit of the law, that the laws cannot restrict the liberty or the rights of citizens except for the sake of public utility. That every member of the state is bound to labor for the public good, according to his position and fortune, and that the rights of individuals must give way to the interests of the public. There is no mention of the hereditary right of the sovereign and his family, nor even of any private rights distinct from the rights of the state. The name of the state is the only one used to designate royal power. On the other hand, much is said about the general rights of man. These general rights of man are based on the natural liberty of each to pursue his advantage, provided it be done without injury to the rights of others. All actions not forbidden by the natural law, or by the positive laws of the state, are permitted. Every inhabitant of the state may demand from it protection for his person and property, and has the right to defend himself by force if the state does not come to his assistance. After laying down these first great principles, the legislator, instead of deducing from them, as in the Code of 1791, the doctrine of the sovereignty of the people and the organization of a popular government in a free state of society, turns shortly round and arrives at another result equally democratic but by no means liberal. He looks upon the sovereign as the sole representative of the state, and invests him with all the rights that have been recognized as belonging to society. In this code the sovereign is no longer the representative of God, he is the representative of society, its agent and its servant, to use Frederick's own words printed in his works, but he alone represents it, he alone wields its whole power. The head of the state, says the introduction, whose duty it is to bring forth the general good, which is the sole object of society, is authorized to govern and direct all the actions of individuals towards that end. Among the chief duties of this all-powerful agent of society we find the following: to preserve peace and public security at home, and to protect everyone against violence. Abroad it is for him to make peace or war. He only is to make laws and enact general police regulations. He alone possesses the right to pronounce pardons and to stop criminal proceedings. All associations that may exist in the state, and all public establishments, are subject to his inspection and direction for the sake of general peace and security. In order that the head of the state may be enabled to fulfill these obligations, he must possess certain revenues and profitable rights. Accordingly, he has the power of taxing private fortunes and persons, their professions, their trades, their produce, or their consumption. The orders given by the public functionaries who act in his name are to be obeyed, like his own, in all matters within the limits of their functions. Beneath this perfectly modern head we shall presently see a thoroughly Gothic body. Frederick only removed from it whatever stood in the way of the action of his own power, and the result was a monster which looked like a transition from one order of creation to another. In this strange production Frederick exhibited as much contempt for logic as care for his own power and anxiety not to place needless difficulties in his own way by attacking that which was still strong enough to defend itself. The inhabitants of the rural districts, with the exception of a few districts and a few places, were in a state of hereditary servitude, which was not confined to the forced labor and services inherent to the possession of certain estates, but which extended, as we have seen, to the person of the possessor. Most of the privileges of the owners of the soil were confirmed afresh by the Code. It may even be said that they were confirmed in opposition to the Code, since it states that where the local customs and the new legislation differed the former were to be followed. It formally declares that the state cannot destroy any of these privileges except by purchasing them and the following forms of justice. The Code asserted, it is true, that serfage, properly so called, Leibagenschaft, inasmuch as it established personal servitude, was abolished, but the hereditary subjection which replaced it, Verbunterthanigkeit, was still a kind of servitude. As may be seen by reading the text. In the same code the burgher remained carefully separated from the peasant. Between the burghers and the nobility a sort of intermediate class was recognized, composed of high functionaries who were not noble, ecclesiastics, professors of learned schools, gymnasia and universities. Though apart from the rest of the burghers, these men were by no means confounded with the nobles, they remained in a position of inferiority towards them. They could not in general purchase noble estates, Rittergüter, or fill the highest places in the civil service. Moreover, they were not Hoffähig, that is to say, they could not be presented at court except in very rare cases, and never with their families. As in France, this inferiority was the more irksome, because every day this class became more enlightened and influential, and the burgher functionaries of the state, though they did not occupy the most brilliant posts, already filled those in which the work was the hardest and the most important. The irritation against the privileges of the nobility, which was about to contribute so largely to the French Revolution, prepared the way for the approbation with which it was at first received in Germany. The principal author of the Code, nevertheless, was a burgher, but he doubtless followed the directions of his master. The ancient constitution of Europe was not sufficiently destroyed in this part of Germany to make Frederick believe that, in spite of the contempt with which he regarded it, the time was yet come for sweeping away its remains. He mostly confined himself to depriving the nobles of the right of assembling and governing collectively, and left each individual in possession of his privileges, only restricting and regulating their application. Thus it happened that this code, drawn up under the direction of a disciple of our philosophers, and put in force after the French Revolution had broken out, is the most authentic and the most recent legislative document that gives a legal basis to those very feudal inequalities which the Revolution was about to abolish throughout Europe. In it the nobility was declared to be the principal body in the state, the nobles were to be appointed by preference, it says, to all posts of honor which they might be competent to fill. They alone might possess noble estates, create entails, enjoy the privileges of sporting and of the administration of justice inherent in noble estates, as well as the rights of patronage over the church. They alone might take the name of the estates they possessed. The burghers who were authorized by express exemption to own noble estates could only enjoy the rights and honors attached to their ownership, within the precise limits of this permission. A burgher possessed of a noble estate could not bequeath it to an heir of his own class unless he was within the first degree of consanguinity. If there was no such heir, or any heir of noble birth, the estate was to be sold by public auction. One of the most characteristic parts of Frederick's Code is the penal law for political offences, which is appended to it. The successor of the great Frederick, Frederick William II, who, in spite of the feudal and absolutist portion of the legislation, of which I have given a sketch, thought he perceived a revolutionary tendency in his uncle's production, and accordingly delayed its publication until 1794, was only reassured. It is said, by the excellent penal regulations by means of which this code corrected the bad principles which it contained. Never, indeed, has anything been contrived, even since that time, more perfect in its kind. Not only were revolts and conspiracies to be punished with the greatest severity, but even disrespectful criticisms of the acts of the government were likewise to be most severely repressed. The purchase and dissemination of dangerous works was carefully prohibited. The printer, the publisher, and the disseminator were made responsible for the sins of the author. Ridottos, masquerades, and other amusements, were declared to be public assemblages, and must be authorized by the police. The same thing held good with respect to dinners in public places. The liberty of the press and of speech was completely subjected to an arbitrary surveillance. The carrying of firearms was also prohibited. In the midst of this production, of which half was borrowed from the Middle Ages, there appear regulations, which, by their extreme spirit of centralization, actually bordered on socialism. Thus, it is laid down that it is incumbent on the state to provide food, work, and wages for all who are unable to maintain themselves, and who are not entitled to assistance either from the Lord or from the parish, for such as these work was to be provided, according to their strength and capacity. The state was to form establishments for the relief of the poverty of its citizens. The state, moreover, was authorized to destroy foundations which tended to encourage idleness, and to distribute amongst the poor the money under their control. The novelty and boldness of the theories, and the timidity in practice which characterizes this work of the great Frederick, may be found in every part of it. On the one hand, it proclaimed the great principle of modern society, that all ought to be alike subject to taxation. On the other, it suffered the provincial laws, which contain exemptions from this rule, to subsist. It ordained that all lawsuits between a subject and the sovereign shall be judged according to the forms and precedents laid down for all other litigation. But, in fact, this rule was never obeyed when the interests or the passions of the king were opposed to it. The mill of Sans Souci was ostentatiously exhibited, while on many other occasions justice was quietly suppressed. The best proof of how little real innovation was contained in this apparently innovating code, and which, therefore, renders it a most curious study for those who desire to know the true state of society in that part of Germany at the end of the 18th century, is that the Prussian nation scarcely seemed to be conscious of its publication. The legists alone studied it, and at the present day a great number of educated men have never read it. Note 7. Lands of the peasants in Germany. Amongst the peasantry there were many families who were not only freemen and owners of land, but whose estates formed a perpetual entail. The estate they possessed could not be divided, and was inherited by only one of the sons, usually the youngest, as is the case in certain English customs. This son was only bound to pay a certain portion to his brothers and sisters. These erbgüter of the peasantry were more or less common throughout Germany, for in no part of it was the whole of the soil swallowed up by the feudal system. In Silesia, where the nobility still retain immense domains, of which most of the villages formed a part, there were nevertheless villages owned entirely by their inhabitants, and entirely free. In certain parts of Germany, such as the Tyrol and Friesland, the predominant state of things was that the peasants owned the soil as erbgüter. But in the greater part of Germany this kind of possession was but a more or less frequent exception. In the villages where it existed the small proprietors of this kind formed a sort of aristocracy among the peasantry. Note 8. Position of the nobility and division of lands along the banks of the Rhine. From information gathered on the spot, and from persons who lived under the old state of things, I gather that in the electorate of Cologne, for instance, there was a great number of villages without lords, governed by the agents of the prince. That in those places where the nobility existed, its administrative powers were much restricted, that its position was rather brilliant than powerful, at least individually. That they enjoyed many honors, and formed part of the council of the prince, but exercised no real and immediate power over the people. I have ascertained from other sources that in the same electorate property was much divided, and that a great number of the peasants were landowners. This was mainly attributable to the state of embarrassment and almost distress in which so many of the noble families had long lived, and which compelled them constantly to alienate small portions of their land which were bought by the peasants, either for ready money or at a fixed rent charge. I have read a census of the population of the bishopric of Cologne at the beginning of the 18th century, which gives the state of landed property at that time, and I find that even then 1/3 of the soil belonged to the peasants. From this fact arose a combination of feelings and ideas which brought the population of this part of Germany far nearer to a state of revolution than that of other districts in which these peculiarities had not yet shown themselves. Note 9. How the usury laws had accelerated the subdivision of the soil. A law prohibiting usury at whatever rate of interest was still in force at the end of the 18th century. We learn from Turgot that even so late as 1769 it was still observed in many places. The law subsists, says he, though it is often violated. The consular judges allow interest stipulated without alienation of the capital, while the ordinary tribunals condemn it. We may still see fraudulent debtors bring criminal actions against their creditors for lending them money without alienation of the capital. Independently of the effects which this legislation could not fail to produce upon commerce, and upon the industrial habits of the nation generally, it likewise had a very marked influence on the division and tenure of the land. It had multiplied, ad infinitum, perpetual rent charges, both on real and other property. It had led the ancient owners of the soil instead of borrowing when they wanted money to sell small portions of their estates for payments partly in capital and partly in perpetual annuities. This had contributed greatly on the one hand to the subdivision of the soil, and on the other to burdening the small proprietors with a multitude of perpetual services. Note 10. Example of the passions excited by the tithes 10 years before the Revolution. In 1779 an obscure lawyer of Luce complained in very bitter language, which already had a flavor of the Revolution, that the cures and other great tithe-holders sold to the farmers, at an exorbitant price, the straw they had received in tithe, which was indispensable to the latter for making manure. Note 11. Example of the manner in which the clergy alienated the people by the exercise of its privileges. In 1780 the prior and the canons of the Priory of Laval complained of an attempt to subject them to the payment of the tariff duties on articles of consumption, and on the materials needed for the repairs of their buildings. They pleaded that as the tariff duties represented the taille, and as they were exempt from the taille, they therefore owed nothing. The minister referred them to a decision at the election, with the right of appeal to the Cour des Aides. Note 12. Feudal rights possessed by priests. One example from amongst 1,000. Abbey of Cherbourg, 1753. This abbey possessed at this period the seigneurial rent charges, payable in money or in kind in almost every parish round Cherbourg. One single village owed it 306 bushels of wheat. It owned the barony of Asti-Genevieve, the barony and the seigneurial mill of Bas-du-Roule, and the barony of Neuville-aux-Plaines, situated at a distance of at least 10 leagues. It received moreover the tithes of 12 parishes in the peninsula, of which several were very distant from it. Note 13. Irritation among the peasants caused by feudal rights, and especially by the feudal rights of the priests. The following letter was written shortly before the Revolution by a farmer to the intendant himself. It cannot be quoted as an authority for the truth of the facts which it alleges, but it is a perfect indication of the state of feeling among the class to which its writer belonged. Although we have few nobles in this part of the country, says he, you must not suppose that the land is any the less burdened with rent charges. Far from it, almost all the fiefs belong to the cathedral, to the archbishopric, to the College of St. Martin, to the Benedictines of Noirmoutiers, of St. Julian, and other ecclesiastics, who never suffer them to lapse from disuse, but perpetually hatch fresh ones out of musty old parchments which are manufactured God only knows how. The whole country is infected with rent charges. The greater part of the land owes annually a seventh of wheat per half acre, others owe wine, one has to send a quarter of his fruit to the seigneury, another the fifth, and the tithe being always previously deducted, this man a twelfth, that a 13th. All these rights are so strange that I know them of all amounts, from a fourth to a 40th of the fruit. What is to be said of the dues payable in all kinds of grain, vegetables, money, poultry, labor, wood, fruit, candles? I know strange dues in bread, wax, eggs, pigs without the head, wreaths of roses, bunches of violets, gilt spurs, and there is also a countless multitude of other seigneurial rights. Why has not France been released from all these absurd dues? At last men's eyes are beginning to be opened, and everything may be hoped from the wisdom of the present government. It will stretch forth a helping hand to the poor victims of the exactions of the old fiscal laws called seigneurial rights, which ought never to be alienated or sold. Again, what shall we think of the tyranny of fines, lauds et ventes? A purchaser exhausts his means to buy some land, and is then compelled to pay heavy expenses for adjudication and contract, entering upon possession, procès-verbaux, control, verification and registration, insinuation, 100th denier, 8 sous in the livre, and besides all this, he has to submit his contract to his seigneur, who makes him pay the fines, lauds et ventes, on the principal of his purchase. Some exact a 12th, others a 10th, some demand a 15th, others a 15th and a 5th of that again. In short, they are to be found of all prices, and I even know some who exact a third of the purchase money. No, the fiercest and most barbarous nations in the universe never invented exactions so great and so numerous as those of which our tyrants have heaped upon the heads of our forefathers. This philosophical and literary tirade is misspelt throughout. How can the late king have authorized the redemption of rent charges on property in towns and not have included those in the country? The latter ought to have come first. Why should the poor farmers not be allowed to burst their fetters, to redeem and free themselves from the multitude of seigneurial rent charges which cause so much injury to the vassals and so little profit to their lords? There ought to be no distinction as to the power of redemption between town and country and between the lords and private persons. The intendants of the incumbents of ecclesiastical property pillage and mulct all their farmers every time the property changes hands. We have a recent example of this. The intendant of our new archbishop on his arrival gave notice to quit to all the farmers of his predecessor M. de Fleury, declared all the leases which they had taken under him to be void, and turned out all who would not double their leases and give over again heavy pots de vin, which they had already paid to the intendant of M. de Fleury. They were thus deprived, in the most notorious manner, of 7 or 8 years of their leases which had still to run, and were forced to leave their homes suddenly just before Christmas, the most critical time of the year on account of the difficulty of procuring food for cattle, without knowing where to go for shelter. The King of Prussia could have done no worse. It seems, indeed, that on ecclesiastical property the leases of the preceding incumbent were not legally binding on his successor. The author of the above letter is quite correct in his statement that the feudal rent charges were redeemable in the towns and not in the country. It is a fresh proof of the neglect shown towards the peasantry, and of the way in which all those placed above them found means to forward their own interests. Note 14. Effects of feudalism. Every institution that has long been dominant, after establishing itself firmly in its proper sphere, penetrates beyond it, and ends by exerting considerable influence even over that part of the legislation which it does not govern. Thus feudalism, although it belonged above all to political law, had transformed the whole civil law as well, and deeply modified the state of property and of persons in all the relations of private life. It had affected the law of inheritance by the inequality of partition, a principle which had even reached down to the middle classes in certain provinces, for instance, Normandy. Its influence had extended over all real property, for no landed estates were entirely excluded from its action, or of which the owners did not in some way feel its effects. It affected not only the property of individuals but even that of the communes. It reacted on manufactures by the duties which it levied upon them. It reacted on private incomes by the inequality of public employments, and on pecuniary interests generally in every man's business, on landowners by dues, rent charges, and the corvée. On the tenant in 1,000 different ways, amongst others by the bainalites, the right of the seigneur to compel his vassals to grind their corn at his mill, and seigneurial monopolies, perpetual rent charges, fines, and on tradesmen, by the market dues, on merchants by the transport dues, and by putting the final stroke to the feudal system. The revolution made itself seen and felt, so to speak, at all the most sensitive points of private interest. Note 15. Public charity distributed by the state. Favoritism. In 1748 the king granted 20,000 pounds of rice. It was a year of great want and scarcity, like so many in the 18th century. The Archbishop of Tours asserted that this relief was obtained by him, and ought therefore to be distributed by him alone and in his own diocese. The intendant declared that the succor was granted to the whole generalite, and ought therefore to be distributed by him to all the different parishes. After a protracted struggle, the king, by way of conciliating both, doubled the quantity of rice intended for the generalite, so that the archbishop and the intendant might each distribute half. Both were agreed that the distribution should be made by the cures. There was no question of entrusting it to the seigneurs or to the syndics. We see, from the correspondence between the intendant and the comptroller general, that in the opinion of the former the archbishop wanted to give the rice entirely to his own protégés, and especially to cause the greater part of it to be distributed in the parishes belonging to the Duchess of Roquecourt. On the other hand, we find among these papers letters from great noblemen asking relief for their own parishes in particular, and letters from the comptroller general recommending the parishes belonging to particular persons. Legal charity gives scope for abuses, whatever be the system pursued, but it is perfectly impracticable when exercised from a distance and without publicity by the central government. Note 16. Example of the manner in which this legal charity was administered. We find in the report made to the Provincial Assembly of Upper Guyenne in 1780, out of the sum of 385,000 livres, the amount of the funds granted by His Majesty to this generalite from 1773, when the travaux de charite were first established, until 1779 inclusively, the elective district of Montauban, which is the chef-lieu and residence of the intendant, has received for its own share above 240,000 livres, the greater part of which sum was actually paid to the Communauté of Montauban. Note 17. Powers of the intendant for the regulation of trades and manufactures. The archives of the intendancies are full of documents relating to this regulation of trades and manufactures. Not only was industry subjected to the restrictions placed upon it by the corps d'état, maîtresses, but it was abandoned to all the caprices of the government, usually represented by the King's Council, as far as general regulations went, and by the intendants in their special application. We find the latter constantly interfering as to the length of which the pieces of cloth are to be woven, the pattern to be chosen, the method to be followed, and the defects to be avoided in the manufacture. They had under their orders, independently of the subdelegates, local inspectors of manufactures. In this respect centralization was pushed even further than at the present time. It was more capricious and more arbitrary, it raised up swarms of public functionaries, and created all manner of habits of submission and dependence. It must be remembered that these habits were engrafted above all upon the manufacturing and commercial middle classes whose triumph was at hand, far more than upon those which were doomed to defeat. Accordingly the revolution, instead of destroying these habits, could not fail to make them spread and predominate. All the preceding remarks have been suggested by the perusal of a voluminous correspondence and other documents, entitled Manufactures and Fabrics, Drapery, Dry Goods, which are to be found among the remaining papers belonging to the archives of the Intendancy of the Isle of France. They likewise contain frequent and detailed reports from the inspectors to the intendant of the visits they have made to the various manufactures, in order to ascertain whether the regulations laid down for the methods of fabrication are observed. There are, moreover, sundry orders in council, given by the advice of the intendant, prohibiting or permitting the manufacture, either in certain places, of certain stuffs, or according to certain methods. The predominant idea in the remarks of these inspectors, who treat the manufacturers with great disdain, is that it is the duty and the right of the state to compel them to do their very best, not only for the sake of the public interest, but for their own. Accordingly they thought themselves bound to force them to adopt the best methods, and to enter carefully into every detail of their art, accompanying this kind interest with countless prohibitions and enormous fines. Note 18. Spirit of the Government of Louis XI. No document better enables us to estimate the true spirit of the government of Louis XI than the numerous constitutions granted by him to the towns. I have had occasion to study very carefully those which he conferred on most of the towns of Anjou, of Maine, and of Touraine. All these constitutions are formed on the same model, and the same designs are manifest in them all. The figure of Louis XI, which they reveal to us, is rather different from the one which we are familiar with. We are accustomed to consider him as the enemy of the nobility, but at the same time as the sincere though somewhat stern friend of the people. Here, however, he shows the same hatred towards the political rights of the people and of the nobility. He makes use of the middle classes to pull down those above them, and to keep down those below. He is equally anti-aristocratic and anti-democratic. He is essentially the citizen king. He heaps privileges upon the principal persons of the towns, whose importance he desires to increase. He profusely confers nobility on them, thus lowering its value, and at the same time he destroys the whole popular and democratic character of the administration of the towns, and restricts the government of them to a small number of families attached to his reforms, and bound to his authority by immense advantages. Note 19. Administration of a town in the 18th century. I extract from the inquiry made in 1764 into the administration of towns, the document relating to Angers. In it we shall find the constitution of the town analyzed, attacked, and defended by turns by the presidial, the corporation, the subdelegate, and the intendant. As the same facts were repeated in a great number of other places, this must not be looked upon merely as an individual picture. Report of the presidial on the actual state of the municipal corporation of Angers, and on the reforms to be made in it. The corporation of Angers, says the presidial, never consults the inhabitants generally, even on the most important subjects, except in cases in which it is obliged by special orders to do so. This system of administration is, therefore, unknown to all those who do not belong to the corporation, even to the échevins immovables, who have but a very superficial idea of it. The tendency of all these small civic oligarchies was, indeed, to consult what are here called the inhabitants generally as little as possible. The corporation was composed, according to an arrêt de règlement of March 29, 1681, of 21 officers. A mayor, who becomes noble, and whose functions continue for 4 years. 4 échevins immovables, who remain in office 2 years. 12 échevins consilers, who, when once elected, remain for life. 2 procureurs de ville. 1 procureur in reversion. 1 greffier. They possessed various privileges, amongst others the following: their capitation tax was fixed and moderate, they were exempt from having soldiers billeted upon them and from providing ustensiles, furnitures, and contributions. From the franchise de droits, the cloison double and triple, the old and new octroi and accessoire on all articles of consumption, even from the don gratuit, from which, says the presidial, they chose to exempt themselves on their own private authority. They receive moreover allowances for wax lights, and some of them salaries and apartments. We see by these details that it was a very pleasant thing to be perpetual échevins of Angers in those days. Always and everywhere we find the system which makes the exemption from taxation fall on the richest classes. In a subsequent part of the same report we read, these places are sought by the richest inhabitants, who aspire to them in order to obtain a considerable reduction of capitation, the surcharge of which falls on the others. There are at present several municipal officers, whose fixed capitation is 30 livres, whereas they ought to be taxed 250 or 300 livres. There is one especially among them, who, considering his fortune, might pay, at least, 1,000 livres of capitation tax. We find in another part of the same report, that, amongst the richest inhabitants there are upwards of 40 officers, or widows of officers, men holding office, whose places confer on them the privilege of not contributing to the heavy capitation levied on the town. The burden of this capitation accordingly falls on a vast number of poor artisans, who think themselves overtaxed, and constantly appeal against the excessive charges upon them, though almost always unjustly. Inasmuch as there is no inequality in the distribution of the amount, which remains to be paid by the town. The General Assembly consisted of 76 persons. The mayor, 2 deputies from the chapter, 1 syndic of the clerks, 2 deputies from the presidial, 1 deputy from the university, 1 lieutenant general of police, 4 échevins, 12 consilers échevins, 1 procureur du roi au presidial, 1 procureur de ville, 2 deputies from the eaux et forêts, 2 from the elective district, 2 from the grenier à sel, 2 from the traits, 2 from the mint, 2 from the body of avocats and procureurs, 2 from the juges consuls, 2 from the notaries, 2 from the body of merchants, and, lastly, 2 sent by each of the 16 parishes. These last were supposed to represent the people, properly so called, especially the industrial corporations. We see that care had been taken to keep them in a constant minority. When the places in the town corporation fell vacant, the General Assembly selected 3 persons to fill each vacancy. Most of the offices belonging to the Hôtel de Ville were not exclusively given to members of corporations, as was the case in several municipal constitutions, that is to say, the electors were not obliged to choose from among them their magistrates, advocates, and this was highly disapproved by the members of the presidial. According to this presidial, which appears to have been filled with the most violent jealousy against the corporation of the town, and which I strongly suspect objected to nothing so much in the municipal constitution as that it did not enjoy as many privileges in it as it desired, the General Assembly, which is too numerous, and consists, in part, of persons of very little intelligence, ought only to be consulted in cases of sale of the communal domains, loans, establishment of octroys, and elections of municipal officers. All other business matters might be discussed in a smaller assembly, composed only of the notables. This assembly should consist only of the lieutenant general of the sénéchaussée, the procureur du roi, and 12 other notables, chosen from amongst the 6 bodies of clergy, magistracy, nobility, university, trade, and bourgeois, and others not belonging to the above-named bodies. The choice of the notables should at first be confined to the General Assembly, and subsequently to the Assembly of Notables, or to the body from which each notable is to be selected. All these functionaries of the state, who thus entered in virtue of their office or as notables into the municipal corporations of the ancien régime, frequently resembled those of the present day as to the name of the office which they held, and sometimes even as to the nature of that office. But they differed from them completely as to the position which they held, which must be carefully borne in mind, unless we wish to arrive at false conclusions. Almost all these functionaries were notables of the town previous to being invested with public functions, or they had striven to obtain public functions in order to become notables. They had no thought of leaving their own town and no hope of any higher promotion, which alone is sufficient to distinguish them completely from anything with which we are acquainted at the present day. Report of the Municipal Officers. We see by this that the corporation of the town was created in 1474, by Louis XI. On the ruins of the ancient democratic constitution of the town, on the system which we have already described of restricting political rights to the middle classes only, of setting aside or weakening the popular influence of creating a great number of municipal officers in order to interest a greater number of persons in his reform, of a prodigal grant of hereditary nobility, and of all sorts of privileges, to that part of the middle classes in whose hands the administration was placed. We find in the same report letters patent from the successors of Louis XI, which acknowledge this new constitution, while they still further restrict the power of the people. We learn that in 1485 the letters patent issued to this effect by Charles VIII were attacked before the Parliament by the inhabitants of Angers, just as in England a lawsuit, arising out of the charter of a town, would have been brought before a court of justice. In 1601 a decision of the Parliament determined the political rights created by the Royal Charter. From that time forward nothing appears but the Conseil du Roi. We gather from the same report that, not only for the office of mayor, but for all other offices belonging to the corporation of the town, the General Assembly proposed 3 candidates, from amongst whom the king selects one. In virtue of a decree of the Council of June 22, 1708. It appears, moreover, that in virtue of decisions of the Council of 1733 and 1741, the merchants had the right of claiming one place of échevin or consiglor, the perpetual échevins. Lastly, we find that at that period the corporation of the town was entrusted with the distribution of the sums levied for the capitation, the ustensile, the barracks, the support of the poor, the soldiery, coast guard, and foundlings. There follows a long enumeration of the labors to be undergone by the municipal officers, which fully justified, in their opinion, the privileges and the perpetual tenure of office, which they were evidently greatly afraid of losing. Many of the reasons which they assign for their exertions are curious. Amongst others, the following: their most important avocations, they say, consist in the examination of financial affairs, which continually increased, owing to the constant extension of the droits d'aides, the gabelle, the control, the insinuation de actes, perception illicite de droits d'enregistrement et de francs fiefs. The opposition which was incessantly offered by the financial companies to these various taxes compelled them to defend actions in behalf of the town before the various jurisdictions, either the Parliament or the Conseil du Roi, in order to resist the oppression under which they suffered. The experience and practice of 30 years had taught them that the term of a man's life scarcely suffices to guard against all the snares and pitfalls which the clerks of all the departments of the firms continually set for the citizens in order to keep their own commissions. The most curious circumstance is, that all this is addressed to the Comptroller General himself, in order to dispose him favorably towards the privileges of those who make the statement. So inveterate had the habit become of looking upon the companies charged with the collection of the taxes as an enemy who might be attacked on every side without blame or opposition. This habit grew stronger and more universal every day, until all taxation came to be looked upon as an unfair and hateful tyranny, not as the agent of all men, but as the common enemy. The union of all the offices, the report goes on to say, was effected for the first time by an order in council of the September 4, 1694, for a sum of 22,000 livres. That is to say, that the offices were redeemed in that year for the above-named sum. By an order of April 26, 1723, the municipal offices created by the Edict of May 24, 1722, were united to the corporation of the town, or, in other words, the town was authorized to purchase them. By another order of May 24, 1723, the town was permitted to borrow 120,000 livres for the purchase of the said offices. Another order of July 26, 1728, allowed it to borrow 50,000 livres for the purchase of the office of greffier secretary of the Hôtel de Ville. The town, says the report, has paid these monies in order to maintain the freedom of its elections, and to secure to the officers elected, some for 2 years and others for life, the various prerogatives belonging to their offices. A part of the municipal offices having been re-established by the Edict of November, 1733, an order in council intervened, dated January 11, 1751, at the request of the mayor and échevins, fixing the rate of redemption at 170,000 livres, for the payment of which a prorogation of the octroys was granted for 15 years. This is a good specimen of the administration of the monarchy, as far as the towns were concerned. They were forced to contract debts, and then authorized to impose extraordinary and temporary taxes in order to pay them. Moreover, I find that these temporary taxes were frequently rendered perpetual after some time, and then the government took its share of them. The report continues thus: the municipal officers were only deprived of the important judicial powers with which Louis XI had invested them by the establishment of royal jurisdictions. Until 1669 they took cognizance of all disputes between masters and workmen. The accounts of the octroys are rendered to the intendant, as directed in all the decrees for the creation or prorogation of the said octroys. We likewise find in this report that the deputies of the 16 parishes, who were mentioned above, and who appeared at the General Assembly, were chosen by the companies, corporations, or communautes, and that they were strictly the envoys of the small bodies by which they were deputed. They were bound by exact instructions on every point of business. Lastly, this report proves that at Angers, as everywhere else, every kind of expenditure was to be authorized by the intendant and the council. And, it must be admitted, that when the administration of a town is given over completely into the hands of a certain number of men, to whom, instead of fixed salaries, are conceded privileges which place them personally beyond the reach of the consequences which their administration may produce upon the private fortunes of their fellow citizens, this administrative superintendence may appear necessary. The whole of the report, which is very ill drawn up, betrays extraordinary dread, on the part of the official men, of any change in the existing order of things. All manner of arguments, good and bad, are brought forward by them in favor of maintaining the status quo. Report of the Subdelegate. The intendant, having received these two reports of opposite tendency, desires to have the opinion of his subdelegate, who gives it as follows. The report of the municipal councillors, says he, does not deserve a moment's attention. It is merely intended to defend the privileges of those officers. That of the presidial may be consulted with advantage, but there is no reason for granting all the prerogatives claimed by those magistrates. According to the subdelegate, the constitution of the Hôtel de Ville has long stood in need of reform. Besides the immunities already mentioned, which were enjoyed by the municipal officers of Angers, he informs us that the mayor, during his tenure of office, had a dwelling which was worth, at least, 600 francs rent, a salary of 50 francs. And 100 francs for frais de poste, besides the jetons. The procureur syndic was also lodged, and the greffier as well. In order to procure their own exemption from the droits d'aides and the octroi, the municipal officers had fixed an assumed standard of consumption for each of them. Each of them had the right of importing into the town, free of duty, so many barrels of wine yearly, and the same with all other provisions. The subdelegate does not propose to deprive the municipal councillors of their immunities from taxation, but he desires that their capitation, instead of being fixed and very inadequate, should be taxed every year by the intendant. He desires that they should also be subject, like everyone else, to the don gratuit, which they had dispensed themselves from paying, on what precedent no one can tell. The municipal officers, the report says further, are charged with the duty of drawing up the rolls de capitation for all the inhabitants, a duty which they perform in a negligent and arbitrary manner. Accordingly, a vast number of complaints and memorials are sent in to the intendant every year. It is much to be desired that henceforth the division should be made in the interest of each company or communauté by its own members, according to stated and general rules. The municipal officers would have to make out only the rolls de capitation, for the burghers and others who belong to no corporation, such as some of the artisans and the servants of all privileged persons. The report of the subdelegate confirms what has already been said of the municipal officers, that the municipal offices had been redeemed by the town in 1735 for the sum of 170,000 livres. Letter the Intendant to the Comptroller General. Supported by all these documents, the Intendant writes to the Minister, it is important, for the sake of the inhabitants and of the public good, to reduce the corporation of the town, the members of which are too numerous and extremely burdensome to the public, on account of the privileges they enjoy. I am struck, continues the Intendant, with the enormous sums which have been paid at all periods for the redemption of the municipal offices at Angers. The amount of these sums, if employed on useful purposes, would have been profitable to the town, which, on the contrary, has gained nothing but an increased burden in the authority and privileges enjoyed by these officers. The interior abuses of this administration deserve the whole attention of the council, says the intendant further. Independently of the jettons and the wax lights, which consume an annual sum of 2,127 livres, the amount fixed for expenses of this kind by the normal budget, which from time to time was prescribed for the towns by the king. The public monies are squandered and misapplied at the will of these officers to clandestine purposes, and the procureur du roi, who has been in possession of his place for 30 or 40 years, has made himself so completely master of the administration, with the secret springs of which he alone is acquainted, that the inhabitants have at all times found it impossible to obtain the smallest information as to the employment of the communal revenues. The result of all this is, that the intendant requests the minister to reduce the corporation of the town to a mayor appointed for 4 years, a procureur du roi appointed for 8, and a greffier and receveur appointed for life. Altogether the constitution which he proposes for this corporation is exactly the same as that which he elsewhere suggested for towns. In his opinion it would be desirable, first, to maintain the General Assembly, but only as an electoral body for the election of municipal officers. Second, to create an extraordinary Conseil de Notables, which should perform all the functions which the Edict of 1764 had apparently entrusted to the General Assembly. The said council to consist of 12 members, whose tenure of office should be for 6 years, and who should be elected, not by the General Assembly but by the 12 corporations considered as notable, each corporation electing its own. He enumerates the corps notables as follows: the presidial, the university, the election, the officers of woods and forests, the grenier à sel, the traits, the mint, the avocats and procureurs, the juges consuls, the notaries, the tradesmen, the burghers. It appears that nearly all these notables were public functionaries, and nearly all the public functionaries were notables. Hence we may conclude, as from 1,000 other passages in these documents, that the middle classes were as greedy of place and as little inclined to seek a sphere of activity removed from government employment. The only difference, as I have said in the text, was that formerly men purchased the trifling importance which office gave them, and that now the claimants beg and entreat someone to be so charitable as to get it for them gratis. We see that, according to the project we have described, the whole municipal power was to rest with the extraordinary council, which would completely restrict the administration to a very small middle-class coterie. While the only assembly in which the people still made their appearance at all was to have no privilege beyond that of electing the municipal officers, without any right to advise or control them. It must also be observed that the intendant was more in favor of restriction and more opposed to popular influence than the king, whose edict seemed intended to place most of the power in the hands of the General Assembly. And that the intendant again is far more liberal and democratic than the middle classes, judging at least by the report I have quoted in the text, by which it appears that the notables of another town were desirous of excluding the people even from the election of municipal officers, a right which the king and the intendant had left to them. My readers will have observed that the intendant uses the words burghers and tradesmen to designate 2 distinct categories of notables. It will not be amiss to give an exact definition of these words, in order to show into how many small fractions the middle classes were divided, and by how many petty vanities they were agitated. The word burgher had a general and a restricted sense. It was used to designate those belonging to the middle class, and also to specify a certain number of persons included within that class. The burghers are those whose birth and fortune enable them to live decently, without the exercise of any gainful pursuit, says one of the reports produced on occasion of the inquiry in 1764. We see by the rest of the report that the word burgher was not to be used to designate those who belonged either to the companies or the industrial corporations, but it is more difficult to define exactly to whom it should be applied. For, the report goes on to say, amongst those who arrogate to themselves the title of burgher, there are many persons who have no other claim to it but their idleness, who have no fortune, and lead an obscure and uncultivated life. The burghers ought properly to be distinguished by fortune, birth, talent, morality, and a handsome way of living. The artisans, who compose the communautes, have never been admitted to the rank of notables. After the burghers, the mercantile men formed a second class, which belonged to no company or corporation, but the limits of this small class were hard to define. Are, says the report, the petty tradesmen of low birth to be confounded with the great wholesale dealers? In order to resolve these difficulties, the report proposes to have a list of the notable tradesmen drawn up by the echevins, and given to their head or syndic. In order that he may summon to the deliberations at the Hôtel de Ville none but those set down in it. In this list none were to be inscribed who had been servants, porters, drivers, or who had filled any other mean offices. Note 20. One of the most salient characteristics of the 18th century, as regards the administration of the towns, was not so much the abolition of all representation and intervention of the public in their affairs as the extreme variation of the rules by which the administration was guided. Rights were incessantly granted, recalled, restored, increased, diminished, and modified in 1,000 different ways. Nothing more fully shows into what contempt these local liberties had fallen as this continual change in their laws, which seemed to excite no attention. This variation alone would have been sufficient to destroy beforehand all peculiar ideas, all love of old recollections, all local patriotism in those very institutions which afford the greatest scope for them. This it was which prepared the way for the great destruction of the past, which the Revolution was about to effect. Note 21. Administration of a village in the 18th century. From the papers of the Intendancy of the ILEDE France. I have selected the transaction which I am about to describe from amongst a number of others, in order to give an example of some of the forms followed by the parochial administration, to show how dilatory they were, and to give a picture of the general assembly of a parish during the 18th century. The matter in hand was the repairs to be done to the parsonage and steeple of a rural parish, that of Ivry, in the Ile-de-France. The question was, to whom to apply to get these repairs done, how to determine on whom the expense should fall, and how to procure the sum which was needed. 1. Memorial from the cure to the intendant, setting forth that the steeple and the parsonage are in urgent need of repairs, that his predecessor had added useless buildings to the parsonage, and thus entirely altered and spoiled it. That the inhabitants, having allowed this to be done, were bound to bear the expense of restoring it to a proper condition, and, if they chose, to claim the money from the heirs of the last cure. 2. Ordinance of the Intendant, August 29, 1747, directing that the syndic shall make it his business to convoke a meeting to deliberate on the necessity of the operations demanded. 3. Memorial from the inhabitants, setting forth that they consent to the repairs of the parsonage but oppose those of the steeple, seeing that the steeple is built over the chancel, and that the cure, who is the great tithe-owner, is liable for the repairs of the chancel. By a decree in council of the end of the preceding century, April, 1695, the person in receipt of the great tithes was bound to repair the chancel, the parishioners being charged only with keeping up the nave. 4. Fresh ordinance of the intendant, who, in consequence of the contradictory statements he has received, sends an architect, the Sieur Cordier, to inspect and report upon the parsonage and the steeple, to draw up a statement of the works and to make an inquiry. 5. Procès-verbal of all these operations, by which it appears that at the inquiry a certain number of landowners of Ivry appeared before the commissioner sent by the intendant, which persons appeared to be nobles, burghers, and peasants of the place, and inscribed their declarations for or against the claim set up by the cure. 7. A fresh ordinance of the intendant, to the effect that the statements drawn up by the architect whom he had sent shall be communicated to the landowners and inhabitants of the parish at a fresh general meeting to be convoked by the syndic. 8. Fresh parochial assembly in consequence of this ordinance, at which the inhabitants declare that they persist in their declarations. 9. Ordinance of the intendant, who directs, first, that the adjudication of the work set forth in the architect's statement shall be proceeded with before his subdelegate at Corbeil, in the dwelling of the latter. And that the said adjudication shall be made in the presence of the cure, the syndic, and the chief inhabitants of the parish. Second, that inasmuch as delay would be dangerous, the whole sum shall be raised by a rate on all the inhabitants, leaving those who persist in thinking that the steeple forms part of the choir, and ought therefore to be repaired by the large tithe owners, to appeal to the ordinary courts of justice. 10. Summons issued to all the parties concerned to appear at the house of the subdelegate at Corbeil, where the proclamations and adjudication are to be made. 11. Memorial from the cure and several of the inhabitants, requesting that the expenses of the administrative proceeding should not be charged, as was usually the case, to the adjudicator, seeing that the said expenses were very heavy, and would prevent any one from undertaking the office of adjudicator. 12. Ordinance of the intendant, to the effect that the expenses incurred in the matter of the adjudication shall be fixed by the subdelegate, and that their amount shall form a portion of the said adjudication and rate. 13. Powers given by certain notable inhabitants to the Sieur X, to be present at the said adjudication, and to assent to it, according to the statement of the architect. 14. Certificate of the syndic, to the effect that the usual notices and advertisements have been published. 15. Procès-verbal of the adjudication. Liv. S. D. Estimate of repairs. 487. 0. 0. Expenses of adjudication. 237. 18. 6. 724. 18. 6. 16. Lastly, an order in council, July 23, 1748, authorizing the imposition of a rate to raise the above sum. We see that in this procedure the convocation of the parochial assembly was alluded to several times. The following procès-verbal of the meeting of one of these assemblies will show the reader how business was conducted on such occasions. Act Notary. This day, after the parochial mass at the usual and accustomed place, when the bell had been rung, there appeared at the assembly held before the undersigned X. Notary at Corbeil, and the witnesses hereafter named, the Sieur Michaud, vinedresser, syndic of the said parish, who presented the ordinance of the intendant permitting the assembly to be held, caused it to be read, and demanded that note should be taken of his diligence. Immediately an inhabitant of the said parish appeared, who stated that the steeple was above the chancel, and that consequently the repairs belonged to the cure. There also appeared, here follow the names of some other persons, who, on the other hand, were willing to admit the claim of the cure. Next appeared 15 peasants, laborers, masons, and vinedressers, who declared their adhesion to what the preceding persons had said. There likewise appeared the Sieur Raimbaud, vine-grower, who said that he is ready to agree to whatever Monseigneur the intendant may decide. There also appeared the Sieur X, doctor of the Sorbonne, the cure, who persists in the declarations and purposes of the memorial. Those who appeared demanded that all the above should be taken down in the act, done at the said place of Ivry, in front of the churchyard of the said parish, in the presence of the undersigned, and the drawing up of the present report occupied from 11 o'clock in the morning until 2 o'clock. We see that this parochial assembly was a mere administrative inquiry, with the forms and the cost of judicial inquiries, that it never ended in a vote, and consequently in the manifestation of the will of the parish. That it contained only individual opinions, and had no influence on the determination of the government. Indeed, we learn from a number of other documents that the parochial assemblies were intended to assist the decision of the intendant, and not to hinder it even where nothing but the interests of the parish were concerned. We also find in the same documents that this affair gave rise to 3 inquiries, one before the notary, a second before the architect, and lastly a third, before 2 notaries, in order to ascertain whether the parishioners persisted in their previous declarations. The rate of 524 liv. 10s, imposed by the decree of the July 13, 1748, fell upon all the landowners, privileged or otherwise, as was almost always the case with respect to expenses of this kind. But the principle on which the shares were apportioned to the various persons was different. The tailleables were taxed in proportion to their taille, and the privileged persons according to their supposed fortunes, which gave a great advantage to the latter over the former. Lastly, we find that on this same occasion the division of the sum of 523 livres tens was made by 2 collectors, who were inhabitants of the village. These were not elected, nor did they fill the post by turns, as was commonly the case, but they were chosen and appointed officially by the subdelegate of the intendant. Note 22. The pretext taken by Louis XIV to destroy the municipal liberties of the towns was the bad administration of their finances. Nevertheless, the same evil, as Turgot truly says, continued and increased since the reform introduced by that sovereign. Most of the towns, he adds, are greatly in debt at the present time, partly owing to the sums which they have lent to the government, and partly owing to the expenses and decorations which the municipal officers, who have the disposal of other people's money and have no account to render to the inhabitants, or instructions to receive from them, multiply with a view of distinguishing and sometimes of enriching themselves. Note 23. The state was the guardian of the convents as well as of the communes. Example of this guardianship. The Comptroller General, on authorizing the intendant to pay 15,000 livres to the convent of Carmelites, to which indemnities were owing, desires the intendant to assure himself that this money, which represents a capital, is advantageously reinvested. Analogous facts were constantly recurring. Note 24. Showing that the administrative centralization of the old monarchy could be best judged of in Canada. The physiognomy of the metropolitan government can be most fully appreciated in the colonies, because at that distance all its characteristic features are exaggerated and become more visible. When we wish to judge of the spirit of the administration of Louis XIV and its vices, it is to Canada we must look. There we shall see the deformity of the object of our investigation, as through a microscope. In Canada a host of obstacles, which anterior circumstances or the ancient state of society opposed either in secret or openly to the spirit of the government, did not exist. The nobility was scarcely seen there, or, at all events, it had no root in the soil, the church had lost its dominant position, feudal traditions were lost or obscured, judicial authority was no longer rooted in ancient institutions and manners. There was nothing to hinder the central power from following its natural bent and from fashioning all the laws according to its own spirit. In Canada accordingly we find not a trace of any municipal or provincial institutions. No authorized collective force, no individual initiative allowed. The intendant occupied a position infinitely more preponderant than that of his fellows in France. The administration interfered in many more matters than in the metropolis, and chose to direct everything from Paris, spite of the 1800 leagues by which they were divided. It adopted none of the great principles by which a colony is rendered populous and prosperous, but, on the other hand, it had recourse to all kinds of trifling artificial processes and petty tyrannical regulations in order to increase and extend the population. Compulsory cultivation, all lawsuits arising out of the grants of land withdrawn from the tribunals and referred to the sole decision of the administration, obligation to pursue particular methods of cultivation, to settle in certain places rather than others, and all these regulations were in force under Louis XIV, and the edicts are countersigned by Colbert. One might imagine oneself in the very thick of modern centralization and in Algeria. Indeed, Canada presents an exact counterpart of all we have seen in Algeria. In both we find ourselves face to face with an administration almost as numerous as the population, preponderant, interfering, regulating, restricting, insisting upon foreseeing everything, controlling everything, and understanding the interests of those under its control better than they do themselves. In short, in a constant state of barren activity. In the United States, on the other hand, the decentralization of the English is exaggerated, the townships have become nearly independent municipalities, small democratic republics. The republican element, which forms the basis of the English constitution and manners, shows itself in the United States without disguise or hindrance, and becomes still further developed. The government, properly so called, does but little in England, and private persons do a great deal, in America, the government really takes no part in affairs, and individuals unite to do everything. The absence of any higher class, which rendered the inhabitants of Canada more submissive to the government than even those of France at the same period, makes the population of the English provinces more and more independent of authority. Both colonies resulted in the formation of a completely democratic state of society, but in one, so long at least as Canada still belonged to France, equality was united with absolutism, in the other it was combined with liberty. As far as the material consequences of the two colonial systems were concerned, we know that in 1763, the period of the conquest, the population of Canada consisted of 60,000 souls, and that of the English provinces of 3 million. Note 25. One example, among many, of the general regulations continually made by the Council of State, which had the force of laws throughout France, and created special offences, of which the administrative tribunals were the sole judges. I take the first which comes to hand, an order in council of the April 29, 1779, which directs that throughout the kingdom the breeders and sellers of sheep shall mark their flocks in a particular manner, under a penalty of 300 livres. His Majesty, it declares, enjoins upon the intendants the duty of enforcing the execution of the present order, which infers that the intendant is to pronounce the penalty on its infraction. Another example, an order in council, December 21, 1778, prohibiting the carriers and drivers to warehouse the goods entrusted to them, under a penalty of 300 livres. His Majesty enjoins upon the Lieutenant General of Police and the intendants to enforce this order. Note 26. Rural Police. The Provincial Assembly of Upper Guyenne urgently demanded the creation of fresh brigades of the Maréchaussée, just as nowadays the General Council of Auvergne or Lot doubtless requests the formation of fresh brigades of gendarmerie. The same idea always prevails, the gendarmerie is the symbol of order, and order can only be sent by government through the gendarme. The report continues, complaints are made every day that there is no police in the rural districts, how should there be? The nobles took no part in affairs, the burghers were all in the towns, and the townships, represented by a vulgar peasant, had no power. And it must be admitted that with the exception of a few cantons in which just and benevolent seigneurs make use of the influence which their position gives them over their vassals in order to prevent those acts of violence to which the country people are naturally inclined. By the coarseness of their manners and the asperity of their character, there nowhere exists any means of restraining these ignorant, rude, and violent men. Such were the terms in which the nobles of the Provincial Assembly allowed themselves to be spoken of, and in which the members of the Tiers État, who made up half the Assembly, spoke of the people in public documents. Note 27. Licenses for the sale of tobacco were as much sought for under the old monarchy as they are now. The greatest people begged for them for their creatures. I find that some were given on the recommendation of great ladies, and one at the request of some archbishops. Note 28. The extinction of all local public life surpassed all power of belief. One of the roads from Maine into Normandy was impracticable. Who do our readers imagine requested to have it repaired? The Generalite of Touraine, which it traversed. The provinces of Normandy or Maine, so deeply interested in the cattle trade which followed this road? Or even some particular canton especially inconvenienced by its impassable condition? The Generalite, the provinces, and the cantons had no voice in the matter. The dealers who travelled on this road and stuck fast in the ruts were obliged to call the attention of the central government to its state, and to write to Paris to the Comptroller General for assistance. Note 29. More or less importance of the seigneurial dues or rent charges, according to the province. Turgot says in his works, I ought to point out the fact that these dues are far more important in most of the rich provinces, such as Normandy, Picardy, and the environs of Paris. In the last named the chief wealth consists in the actual produce of the land, which is held in large farms, from which the owners derive heavy rents. The payments in respect of the lord's rights, in the case even of the largest estates, form but an inconsiderable part of the income arising from these properties, and such payments are little more than nominal. In the poorer provinces, where cultivation is managed on different principles, the lords and nobles have scarcely any land in their own hands. Properties, which are extremely divided, are charged with heavy corn rents, for payment of which all the co-tenants are jointly and severally liable. These rents, in many instances, absorb the bulk of the produce, and the lord's income is almost entirely derived from them. Note 30. Influence of self-government unfavorable to caste. The unimportant labors of the agricultural societies of the 18th century show the adverse influence which the common discussion of general interests exercised on caste. Though the meetings of these societies date from 30 years before the Revolution, when the Ancien regime was still in full force. And though they dealt with theories only, by the very fact of their discussions turning on questions in which the different classes of society felt themselves interested, and, therefore, took common part in, we may at once perceive how they brought men together, and how by means of them, limited as they were to conversations on agriculture, ideas of reasonable reform spread alike among the privileged and unprivileged classes. I am convinced that no government could have kept up the absurd and mad inequality which existed in France at the moment of the Revolution, but one which, like the government of the old monarchy, aimed at finding all its strength in its own ranks. Continually recruited by remarkable men. The slightest contact with self-government would have materially modified such inequality, and soon transformed or destroyed it. Note 31. Provincial liberties may exist for a while without national liberty, when they are ancient, entwined with habits, manners, and early recollections, and while despotism, on the contrary, is recent. But it is against reason to suppose that local liberties may be created at will, or even long maintained, when general liberty is crushed. Note 32. Turgot, in a report to the king, sums up in the following terms, which appear to me singularly exact, the real privileges of the noble class in regard to taxation. 1. Persons of the privileged class have a claim to exemption from all taxation in money to the extent of a 4-plough farm, equivalent in the neighborhood of Paris to an assessment of 2,000 francs. 2. The same persons are entirely exempt from taxation in respect of woods, meadows, vineyards, fish ponds, and for enclosed lands appurtenant to their castles, whatever their extent. In some cantons the principal culture is of meadows or vineyards. In these the noble proprietor escapes from all taxation whatever, the whole weight of which falls on the tax-paying class, another immense advantage for the privileged. Note 33. Indirect privileges in respect of taxation, difference in assessment even when the tax is general. Turgot has given a description of this also, which, judging by the documents, I have reason to believe exact. The indirect advantages of the privileged classes in regard to the poll tax are very great. The poll tax is in its very nature an arbitrary impost, it cannot be distributed among the community otherwise than at random. It has been found most convenient to assess it on the tax collector's books, which are ready prepared. It is true that a separate list has been made out for those whose names do not appear in these books but as they resist payment, while the tax-paying classes have no organ. The poll tax paid by the former in the provinces has gradually dwindled to an insignificant amount, while the poll tax on the latter is almost equal in amount to the whole tax-paying capital. Note 34. Another instance of inequality of assessment in the case of a general tax. It is well known that local rates were general, which sums, say the orders in council authorizing the levy of such rates, shall be levied on all liable, exempt or non-exempt, privileged or non-privileged, without any exception. Together with the poll tax, or in the proportion of a mark to every franc payable as poll tax. Observe that, as the taxpayer's poll tax, assessed according to the assessment for other taxes, was always higher in comparison than the poll tax of the privileged class, inequality reappeared even under the form which seemed most to exclude it. Note 35. On the same subject. I find in a draft edict of 1764, the aim of which is to equalize taxation, all sorts of provisions, the object of which is to preserve exceptional advantages to the privileged classes. In the mode of levy, among these I find that all steps for the purpose of determining, in their case, the value of the assessable property, must be taken in their presence or that of their proxies. Note 36. Admission by the government of the advantages enjoyed by the privileged classes in the assessment even of general taxes. I see, writes the minister, in 1766, that the portion of the taxes most difficult to levy is always that due from the noble and privileged classes, from the consideration the tax collectors feel themselves bound to show such persons. In consequence of which long-standing arrears of far too great an amount will be found due on their poll tax and their 20ths, the tax which they paid in common with the rest of the community. Note 37. In Arthur Young's Travels, in 1789, is a little picture in which the contrast of the systems of the two countries is so well painted, and so happily introduced, that I cannot resist the temptation of citing it. Young, traveling through France during the first excitement caused by the taking of the Bastille, is arrested in a certain village by a crowd, who, seeing him without a cockade, wish to put him in prison. Young contrives to extricate himself by this speech. It has been announced, gentlemen, that the taxes are to be paid as they have been hitherto. Certainly, the taxes ought to be paid, but not as they have been hitherto. They ought to be paid as they are in England. We have many taxes there which you are free from, but the tiers état, the people, does not pay them, they fall entirely on the rich. Thus, in England, every window is taxed. But the man with only 6 windows to his house does not pay anything for them. A nobleman pays his 20ths 1/38 and his king's taxes, but the poor proprietor pays nothing on his little garden. The rich man pays for his horses, carriages and servants, he pays even for a license to shoot his own partridges, the poor man is free from all these burdens. Nay, more, in England we have a tax paid by the rich to help the poor. So that, I say, if taxes are still to be paid, they should be paid differently. The English plan is far the better one. As my bad French, adds Young, was much on a par with their patois, they understood me perfectly. Note 38. The church at Aix, in the electoral district of Cholet, was going to ruin, it was to be repaired in the manner provided by the order of 1684, December 16, viz., by a rate levied on all the inhabitants. When the collectors came to levy this rate, the Marquis de Aix, seigneur of the parish, refused to pay his proportion of the rate, as he meant to take on himself the entire repair of the chancel. The other inhabitants reply, very reasonably, that as lord of the manor and holder of the great tithes, he is bound to repair the chancel, and cannot, on the plea of this obligation, claim to escape his proportion of the common rate. This produces an order of the intendant declaring the Marquis's liability, and authorizing the collector's proceedings. Among the papers on the subject are more than 10 letters from the Marquis, one more urgent than the other, begging hard that the rest of the parish may pay instead of himself, and, to obtain his prayer. Stooping to address the intendant as Monseigneur, and even le supplier. Note 39. An instance of the way in which the government of the old monarchy respected vested rights, formal contracts, and the franchises of towns or corporations. A royal declaration suspending in time of war repayment of all loans contracted by towns, villages, colleges, communities, hospitals, charitable houses, trade corporations, 139 and others, repayable out of town dues by us conceded. Though the instrument securing the said loans stipulates for the payment of interest in the case of non-payment at the stipulated terms. Thus not only is the obligation to repayment at the stipulated terms suspended, but the security itself is impaired. Such proceedings, which abounded under the old monarchy, would have been impracticable under a government acting under the check of publicity or representative assemblies. Compare the above with the respect always shown for such rights in England, and even in America. The contempt of right in this instance is as flagrant as that of local franchises. Note 40. The case cited in the text is far from a solitary instance of an admission by the privileged class that the feudal burdens which weighed down the peasant reached even to themselves. The following is the language of an agricultural society, exclusively composed of this class, 30 years before the Revolution. Perpetual rent charges, whether due to the state or to the lord, if at all considerable in amount, become so burdensome to the tenant that they cause first his ruin, and then that of the land liable to them. The tenant is forced to neglect it, being neither able to borrow on the security of an estate already too heavily burdened, nor to find purchasers if he wished to sell. If then payments were commutable, the tenant would readily be able to raise the means of commuting them by borrowing, or to find purchasers at a price that would cover the value both of the land and the payments with which it might be charged. A man always feels pleasure in keeping up and improving a property of which he believes himself to be in peaceable possession. It would be rendering a great service to agriculture to discover means of commutation for this class of payments. Many lords of manors, convinced of this, would readily give their aid to such arrangements. It would, therefore, be very interesting to discover and point out practicable means for thus ridding land from permanent burdens. Note 41. All public functionaries, even the agents of farmers of the revenue, were paid by exemptions from taxes, a privilege granted by the Order of 1681. A letter from an intendant to the minister in 1782 states, among the privileged orders the most numerous class is that of clerks in the excise of salt, the public domain, the post office, and other royal monopolies of all kinds. There are few parishes which do not include one, in many, 2 or 3 may be found. The object of this letter is to dissuade the minister from proposing an extension of exemption from taxation to the clerks and servants of these privileged agents. Which extension, says the intendant, is unceasingly backed by the farmers general, that they may thus get rid of the necessity of paying salaries. Note 42. The sale of public employments, which were called offices, was not quite unknown elsewhere. In Germany some of the petty princes had introduced the practice to a small extent and in insignificant departments of administration. Nowhere but in France was the system followed out on a grand scale. Note 43. We must not be surprised, strange as it may appear and is, to find, under the old monarchy, public functionaries, many of them belonging to the public service. Properly so called, pleading before the parliaments to ascertain the limits of their own powers. The explanation of this is to be found in the fact that all these questions were questions of private property as well as of public administration. What is here viewed as an encroachment of the judicial power was a mere consequence of the error which the government had committed in attaching public functions to certain offices. These offices being bought and sold, and their holders' income being regulated by the work done and paid for. It was impossible to change the functions of an office without impairing some right for which money had been paid to a predecessor in the office. To quote an instance out of 1,000, at Mans the Lieutenant General of Police carries on a prolonged suit with the Bureau de Finance of the town, to prove, that being charged with the duty of street watching, he has a right to execute all legal instruments relative to the paving of the streets, and to the fees for such instruments. The Bureau replies, that the paving is a duty thrown upon him by the nature of his office. The question in this case is not decided by the King in Council. The Parliament gives judgment, as the principal matter in dispute is the interest of the capital devoted to the purchase of the office. The administrative question becomes a civil action. Note 44. Analysis of the instructions of the Order of Nobility in 1789. The French Revolution is, I believe, the only one, at the beginning of which the different classes were able separately to bear authentic witness to the ideas they had conceived, and to display the sentiments by which they were moved before the Revolution had altered and defaced these ideas and feelings. This authentic testimony was recorded, as we all know, in the cahiers drawn up by the 3 orders in 1789. These cahiers, or instructions, were drawn up under circumstances of complete freedom and publicity, by each of the orders concerned. They underwent a long discussion from those interested, and were carefully considered by their authors, for the government of that period did not, whenever it addressed the nation, undertake both to put the question and to give the answer. At the time when the instructions were drawn up, the most important parts of them were collected in 3 printed volumes, which are to be found in every library. The originals are deposited in the National Archives, and with them the procès-verbaux of the assemblies by which they were drawn up, together with a part of the correspondence which passed between M. Necker and his agents on the subject of these assemblies. This collection forms a long series of folio volumes. It is the most precious document that remains to us from ancient France, and one which should be constantly consulted by those who wish to know the state of feeling amongst our forefathers at the time when the revolution broke out. I at first imagined that the abridgment printed in 3 volumes, which I mentioned above, might perhaps be the work of one party, and not a true representation of the character of this immense inquiry. But on comparing one with the other, I found the strongest resemblance between the large original picture and the reduced copy. The extract from the Cahiers of the Nobility, which I am about to give, contains a true picture of the sentiments of the great majority of that order. It clearly shows how many of their ancient privileges they were obstinately determined to maintain, how many they were not disinclined to give up, and how many they offered to renounce of their own accord. Above all, we see in full the spirit which animated them with regard to political liberty. The picture is a strange and sad one. Individual rights. The nobles demand, first of all, that an explicit declaration should be made of the rights which belong to all men, and that this declaration should confirm their liberties and secure their safety. Liberty of the person. They desire that the servitude to the glebe should be abolished wherever it still exists, and that means should be formed to destroy the slave trade and to emancipate the Negroes. That every man should be free to travel or to reside wherever he may please, whether within or without the limits of the kingdom, without being liable to arbitrary arrest. That the abuses of police regulations shall be reformed, and that henceforth the police shall be under the control of the judges, even in cases of revolt, that no one shall be liable to be arrested or tried except by his natural judges. That, consequently, the state prisons and other illegal places of detention shall be suppressed. Some of them require the demolition of the Bastille. The nobility of Paris is especially urgent upon this point. Are lettres closes, or lettres de cachet, to be prohibited? If any danger of the state renders the arrest of a citizen necessary, without his being immediately brought before the ordinary courts of justice, measures should be taken to prevent any abuses. Either by giving notice of the imprisonment to the Conseil d'État, or by some other proceeding. The nobility demands the abolition of all special commissions, all courts of attribution or exemption, all privileges of committimus, all dilatory judgments, and requires that the severest punishment should be awarded to all those who should issue or execute an arbitrary order. That in common jurisdiction, the only one that ought to be maintained, the necessary measures should be taken for securing individual liberty, especially as regards the criminal, that justice should be dispensed gratuitously. And that useless jurisdictions should be suppressed. The magistrates are instituted for the people, and not the people for the magistrates, says one of the memorials. A demand is even made that a council and gratuitous advocates for the poor should be established in each bailiwick, that the proceedings should be public, and permission granted to the litigants to plead for themselves. That in criminal matters the prisoner should be provided with counsel, and that in all stages of the proceedings the judge should have adjoined to him a certain number of citizens, of the same position in life as the person accused, who are to give their opinion relative to the fact of the crime or offence with which he is charged, referring on this point to the English Constitution. That all punishments should be proportionate to the offence, and alike for all, that the punishment of death should be made more uncommon, and all corporal pains and tortures, should be suppressed. That, in fine, the condition of the prisoner, and more especially of the simply accused, should be ameliorated. According to these memorials, measures should be taken to protect individual liberty in the enlistment of troops for land or sea service, permission should be given to convert the obligation of military service into pecuniary contributions. The drawing of lots should only take place in the presence of a deputation of the 3 orders together. In fact, that the duties of military discipline and subordination should be made to tally with the rights of the citizen and freeman, blows with the back of the saber being altogether done away with. Freedom and inviolability of property. It is required that property should be inviolable, and placed beyond all attack, except for some reason of indispensable public utility. In which case the government ought to give a considerable and immediate indemnity, that confiscation should be abolished. Freedom of trade, handicraft and industrial occupation. The freedom of trade and industry ought to be secured. And, in consequence, freedoms and other privileges of certain companies should be suppressed, and the custom house lines all put back to the frontiers of the country. Freedom of religion. The Catholic religion is to be the only dominant religion in France, but liberty of conscience is to be left to everybody, and the non-Catholics are to be restored to their civil rights and their property. Freedom of the press. Inviolability of the secrecy of the post. The freedom of the press is to be secured, and a law is to establish beforehand all the restrictions which may be considered necessary in the general interest. Ecclesiastical censorship to exist only for books relative to the dogmas of the Church, and in all other cases it is considered sufficient to take the necessary precautions of knowing the authors and printers. Many of the memorials demand that offences of the press should only be tried by juries. The memorials unanimously demand above all that the secrecy of letters entrusted to the post should be inviolably respected, so that, as they say, letters may never be made to serve as means of accusation or testimony against a man. They denounce the opening of letters, crudely enough, as the most odious espionage, inasmuch as it institutes a violation of public faith. Instruction, education. The memorials of the nobility on this point require no more than that active measures should be taken to foster education, that it should be diffused throughout the country, and that it should be directed upon principles conformable to the presumed destination of the children. And, above all, that a national education should be given to the children, by teaching them their duties and their rights of citizenship. They urge the compilation of a political catechism, in which the principal points of the Constitution should be made clear to them. They do not, however, point out the means to be employed for the diffusion of instruction. They do no more than demand educational establishments for the children of the indigent nobility. Care to be taken of the people. A great number of the memorials lay much stress upon greater regard being shown to the people. Several denounce, as a violation of the natural liberty of man, the excesses committed in the name of the police, by which, as they say, quantities of artisans and useful citizens are arbitrarily, and without any regular examination, dragged to prison, to houses of detention, and frequently for slight offences, or even upon simple suspicion. All the memorials demand the definitive abolition of statute labour. The greater portion of the bailiwicks desire the permission to buy off the vassalage and toll dues. And several require that the receipt of many of the feudal dues should be rendered less onerous, and that those paid upon frank fief should be abolished. It is to the advantage of the government, says one of the memorials, to facilitate the purchase and sale of estates. This reason was precisely the one given afterwards for the abolition at one blow of all the seigneurial rights, and for the sale of property in the condition of mainmort. Many of the memorials desire that the droit de colombier, exclusive right of keeping pigeons, should be rendered less prejudicial to agriculture. Demands are made for the immediate abolition of the establishments used as royal game preserves, and known by the name of capitaneries, as a violation of the rights of property. The substitution of taxes less onerous to the people in the mode of levying for those then existing is also desired. The nobility demand that efforts should be made to increase the prosperity and comfort of the country districts. That establishments for spinning and weaving coarse stuffs should be provided for the occupation of the country people during the dead season of the year. That public granaries should be established in each bailiwick, under the inspection of the provincial authorities, in order to provide against times of famine, and to maintain the price of corn at a certain rate. That means should be studied to improve the agriculture of the country, and ameliorate the condition of the country people, that an augmentation should be given to the public works. And that particular attention should be paid to the draining of marsh lands, the prevention of inundations, and finally, that the prizes of encouragement to commerce and agriculture should be distributed in all the provinces. The memorials express the desire that the hospitals should be broken up into smaller establishments, erected in each district. That the asylums for beggars, depots de mendicite, should be suppressed, and replaced by charitable workhouses, ateliers de charite. That funds for the aid of the sick and needy should be established under the management of the provincial states, and that surgeons, physicians, and midwives should be distributed among the arrondissements at the expense of the provinces, to give their gratuitous services to the poor. That the courts of justice should likewise be gratuitous to the people, finally, that care should be taken for the establishment of institutions for the blind, the deaf and dumb, foundling children, and generally speaking, in all these matters the order of nobles does no more than express its desire for reform, without entering into any minor details of execution. It may be easily seen that it mixed much less with the inferior classes than the lower order of clergy, and thus, having come less in contact with their wretchedness, had thought less of the means for mitigating it. Admissibility to public functions, hierarchy of ranks, honorary privileges of the nobility. It is more especially, or rather it is solely, upon the points that concern the hierarchy of ranks and the difference of social classes, that the nobility separates itself from the general spirit of the reforms required, and that, though willing to concede some few important points, it still clings to the principles of the old system. It evidently is aware that it is now struggling for its very existence. Its memorials, consequently, urgently demanded the maintenance of the clergy and the nobility as distinct orders. They even require that efforts should be made to maintain the order of nobility in all its purity, and that to this intent it should be rendered impossible to acquire the title of noble by payment of money. That it should no longer be attached to certain places about court, and that it should only be obtained by merit, after long and useful services rendered to the state. They expressed the desire that men assuming false titles of nobility should be found out and prosecuted. All these memorials, in fact, make urgent protestations in favor of the maintenance of the noble in all his honors. Some even desire that a distinctive mark should be given to the nobles to ensure their exterior recognition. It is impossible to imagine anything more characteristic than this demand, or more indicative of the perfect similitude that must have already existed between the noble and the plebeian in spite of the difference of their social conditions. In general, in its memorials, the nobility, although it appears easily disposed enough to concede many of its more profitable rights, clings energetically to its honorary privileges. So greatly does it feel itself already hurried on by the torrent of democracy, and fear to sink in the stream, that it not only wants to preserve all the privileges it already enjoys, but is desirous of inventing others it never possessed. It is singular to remark how it has a presentiment of the impending danger without the actual perception of it. With regard to public employments, the nobles require that the venality of offices should be done away with in all places connected with the magistracy, and that, in appointments of this kind, the citizens in general should be presented by the nation to the king, and nominated by him without any distinction, except as regards conditions of age and capacity. The majority also opines that the tiers état should not be excluded from military rank, and that every military man, who had deserved well of his country, should have the right to rise to the very highest grade. The order of nobility does not approve of any law that closes the portals of military rank to the order of the tiers état, is the expression used by some of the memorials. But the nobles desire that the right of coming into a regiment as officer, without having first gone through the inferior grades, should be reserved to themselves alone. Almost all the instructions, however, require the establishment of fixed regulations, applicable alike to all, for the bestowal of rank in the army, and demand that they should not be entirely left to favor, but be conferred, with the exception of those of superior officers, by right of seniority. As regards the clerical functions, they require the re-establishment of the elective system in the bestowal of benefices, or at least the appointment by the king of a committee that may enlighten him in the distribution of these benefices. Lastly, they express the opinion that, for the future, pensions ought to be given away with more discernment, that they ought no longer to be exclusively lavished upon certain families. That no citizen ought to have more than one pension, or receive the salary of more than one place at a time, and that all reversions of such emoluments should be abolished. The Church and the Clergy. In matters which do not affect its own interests and a special constitution, the nobility is far less scrupulous. In all that regards the privileges and organization of the Church, its eyes are opened wide enough to existing abuses. It desires that the clergy should have no privileges in matters of taxation, and that it should pay its debts without putting the burden of them on the nation, moreover, that the monastic orders should undergo a complete reformation. The greater part of the instructions declare that these monastic establishments have wholly departed from the original spirit of their institution. The majority of the bailiwicks expressed their desire that the tithes should be made less prejudicial to agriculture. Many demand their abolition altogether. The greater part of the tithes, says one of the memorials, is collected by those incumbents who do the least towards giving spiritual succor to the people. It is easy to perceive that the latter order has not much forbearance for the former in its remarks. No greater respect was shown in its treatment of the Church itself. Several bailiwicks formally admit the right of the States General to suppress certain religious orders, and apply their revenues to some other use. 17 bailiwicks declare the competence of the States General to regulate their discipline. Several complain that the holidays, jours de fête, are too frequent, are prejudicial to agriculture, and are favorable to drunkenness, and suggest that, in consequence, a great number of them ought to be suppressed and kept only on the Sundays. Political rights. As regards political rights, the instructions establish the right of every Frenchman to take his part in the government, either directly or indirectly. That is to say, the right to elect or be elected, but without disturbing the gradation of social ranks, so that no one may nominate or be nominated otherwise than in his own order. This principle once established, it is considered that the representative system ought to be established in such wise, that the power of taking a serious part in the direction of affairs may be guaranteed to each order of the nation. With regard to the manner of voting in the Assembly of the States General, the opinions differ. Most desire a separate vote for each order, others think that an exception ought to be made to this rule in the votes upon taxation. Whilst others again consider that it should always be so. The votes ought to be counted by individuals and not by orders, say the latter. Such a manner of proceeding being the only sensible one, and the only one tending to remove and destroy that egotism of caste, which is the source of all our evils, to bring men together and lead them to that result, which the nation has the right to expect from an assembly, whose patriotism and great moral qualities should be strengthened by its united intelligence. As an immediate adoption of this innovation, however, might prove dangerous in the existing state of general feeling, many of the instructions provide that it should be only decided upon with caution, and that the assembly had better decide whether it were not more prudent to put off the system of individual voting to the following States General. The nobility demands that, in any case, each order should be allowed to preserve that dignity which is due to every Frenchman, and consequently that the humiliating ceremonies, to which the tiers état was subjected under the old system, should be abolished, as, for instance, that of being obliged to kneel, inasmuch, says one of these documents, as the spectacle of one man kneeling before another is offensive to the dignity of man, and emblematic of an inferiority between creatures equal by nature, incompatible with their essential rights. The system to be established in the form of government, and the principles of the Constitution. With regard to the form of government, the nobility desired the maintenance of the monarchical constitution, the preservation of the legislative, judicial, and executive powers in the person of the king, but, at the same time, the establishment of fundamental laws for the purpose of guaranteeing the rights of the nation in the exercise of these powers. All the instructions, consequently, declare that the nation has the right to assemble in States General, composed of a sufficient number of members to ensure the independence of the assembly. And they express the desire that, for the future, these states should assemble at fixed periodical seasons, as well as upon every fresh succession to the throne, without the issue of any writs of convocation. Many of the bailiwicks even advise the permanence of this assembly. If the convocation of the States General were not to take place within the period prescribed by the law, they should have the right of refusing the payment of taxes. Some few of the instructions desire that, during the intervals between the sittings of the states, an intermediary commission should be appointed to watch over the administration of the kingdom. But most of them formally oppose the appointment of any such commission, as being unconstitutional. The reason given for this objection is curious enough. They feared lest so small an assembly, left to itself in the presence of the government, might be seduced by it. The nobility desires that the ministers should not possess the right of dissolving the assembly, and should be punished by law for disturbing it by their cabals. That no public functionary, no one dependent in any way upon the government, should be a deputy. That the person of the deputies should be inviolable, and that they should not be able, according to the terms of the memorials, to be prosecuted for any opinions they may emit. Finally, that the sittings of the assembly should be public, and that, in order that the nation might more generally take part in them, they should be made known by printed reports. The nobility unanimously demands that the principles destined to regulate the government of the state should be applied to the administration of the different parts of the kingdom, and that, consequently, assemblies made up of members freely elected, and for a limited period of time, should be formed in each district and each parish. Many of the instructions recommend that the functions of intendants and receveurs general ought to be done away with. All are of opinion that, in future, the provincial assemblies should alone take in hand the assessment of the taxes, and see to the special interests of the province. The same ought to be the case, they consider, with the assemblies of each arrondissement and of each parish, which ought only to be accountable for the future to the provincial states. Distribution of the powers of state. Legislative power. As regards the distribution of the powers of the state between the assembled nation and the king, the nobility requires that no law should be considered effective until it has been consented to by the States General and the king and entered upon the registers of the courts empowered to maintain the execution of the laws. That the States General should have the exclusive attribute of determining and fixing the amount of the taxes, that all subsidies agreed upon should be only for the period that may elapse between one sitting of the states and the next. That all which may be levied or ordained, without the consent of the states, should be declared illegal, and that all ministers and receivers of such subsidies, who may have ordered or levied them, should be prosecuted as public defaulters. That, in the same way, no loan should be contracted without the consent of the States General, but that a credit alone should be opened, fixed by the states, of which the government might make use in case of war or any great calamity, taking care, however, that measures should be taken to convoke the States General in the shortest possible time. That all the national treasuries should be placed under the superintendence of the states, that the expenses of each department should be fixed by them, and that the surest measures should be taken to see that the funds voted were not exceeded. The greater part of the instructions recommend the suppression of those vexatious taxes, known under the names of insinuation, enterrinement, and centime denier, coming under the denomination of administration, régie, of the royal domains. Upon the subject of which one of the memorials says, the denomination of régie is alone sufficient to wound the feelings of the nation, inasmuch as it puts forward, as belonging to the king, matters which are in reality a part of the property of the citizens. That all the domains, not alienated, should be placed under the administration of the provincial states, and no ordinance, no edict upon financial matters, should be given without the consent of the three orders of the nation. It is evidently the intention of the nobility to confer upon the nation the whole of the financial administration, as well in the regulation of loans and taxes, as in the receipt of the same by the means of the general and provincial assemblies. Judicial power. In the same way, in the judicial organization, it has a tendency towards rendering the power of the judges, at least in a great measure, dependent upon the nation assembled. And thus many of the memorials declare that the magistrates should be responsible for the fact of their appointments to the nation assembled, that they should not be dismissed from their functions without the consent of the States General. That no court of justice, under any pretext whatever, should be disturbed in the exercise of its functions without the consent of these states. That the disputed matters in the appeal court, as well as those before the Parliament, should be decided upon by the States General. The majority of the instructions add that the judges ought only to be nominated by the king, upon presentation to him by the people. Executive power. The executive power is exclusively reserved to the king. But necessary limits are proposed, in order to prevent its abuse. For instance, in the administration, the instructions require that the state of the accounts of the different departments should be rendered public by being printed. Likewise, that before employing the troops in the defense of the country from without, the king should make known his precise intention to the States General. That, in the country itself, the troops should never be employed against the citizens, except upon the requisition of the States General. That the number of the troops should be limited, and that 2/3 of them alone should remain, in common times, upon the second effective list. and that the government ought to keep away all the foreign troops it may have in its pay from the center of the kingdom, and send them to the frontiers. In perusing the instructions of the nobility, the reader cannot fail to be struck, more than all, with the conviction that the nobles are so essentially of their own time. They have all the feelings of the day, and employ its language with perfect fluency. They talk of the inalienable rights of man and the principles inherent to the social compact. In matters appertaining to the individual, they generally look to his rights; in those appertaining to society, to its duties. The principles of their political opinions appear to them as absolute as those of morality, both one and the other being based upon reason. In expressing their desire to abolish the last remnants of serfdom, they talk of effacing the last traces of the degradation of the human race. They sometimes denominate Louis XVI the citizen king, and frequently speak of that crime of lese nation, treason to the nation, which afterwards was so frequently imputed to themselves. In their opinion, as in that of every one else, everything was to be expected from the results of public education, which the states were to direct. The States General, says one of the Caillas, must take care to inspire a national character by alterations in the education of children. Like the rest of their contemporaries, they show a lively and constant desire for uniformity in the legislation, excepting, however, in all that affected the existence of ranks. They are as desirous as the tiers état of administrative uniformity, uniformity of measures, and they point out all kinds of reforms, and expect that these reforms should be radical. According to their suggestions, all the taxes, without exception, should be abolished or transferred, and the whole judicial system changed, except in the case of the seigneurial courts of justice, which they considered only to need improvement. They, as well as all the other French, looked upon France as a field for experiment, a sort of political model farm, in which every portion was to be turned up and every experiment tried, except in one special little corner, where their own privileges blossomed. It must be said to their honor, however, that even this was but little spared by them. In short, as may be seen by reading their memorials, all the nobles wanted in order to make the revolution was that they should be plebeians. Note 45. Specimen of the religious government of an ecclesiastical province in the middle of the 18th century. 1. The Archbishop. 2. 7 Vicars General. 3. 2 ecclesiastical courts, denominated officialites. 1, called the Metropolitan Officialite, took cognizance of the judgments of the suffragans. The other, called the Officialite of the Diocese, took cognizance, 1, of personal affairs between clerical men. 2. Of the validity of marriages, as regarded the performance of the ceremony. This latter court was composed of 3 judges, to whom were adjoined notaries and attorneys. 4. 2 fiscal courts. The one, called the office of the diocese, Bureau Diocesane, took cognizance, in the first instance, of all matters having reference to the dues levied on the clergy of the diocese. As is well known, they were fixed by the clergy themselves. This court was presided over by the archbishop, and made up of 6 other priests. The other court gave judgment in appeals on causes, which had been brought before the other bureaus diocesanes, of the ecclesiastical province. All these courts admitted counsel and heard pleadings. Note 46. General feeling of the clergy in the states and provincial assemblies. What has been said in the text respecting the states of Languedoc is applicable just as well to the provincial assemblies that met in 1779 and 1787, for instance, in Haute-Guyenne. The members of the clergy, in this provincial assembly, were among the most enlightened, the most active, and the most liberal. It was the Bishop of Rodez who proposed to publish the minutes of the assembly. Note 47. This liberal disposition on the part of the priests in political matters, which displayed itself in 1789, was not only produced by the excitement of the moment, evidence of it had already appeared at a much earlier period. It exhibited itself, for instance, in the province of Berry as early as 1779, when the clergy offered to make voluntary donations to the amount of 68,000 livres, upon the sole condition that the provincial administration should be preserved. Note 48. It must be carefully remarked that, if the political conditions of society were without any ties, the civil state of society still had many. Within the circle of the different classes men were bound to each other. Something even still remained of that close tie which had once existed between the class of the seigneurs and the people, and although all this only existed in civil society, its consequence was indirectly felt in political society. The men, bound by these ties, formed masses that were irregular and unorganized, but refractory beneath the hand of authority. The Revolution, by breaking all social ties, without establishing any political ties in their place, prepared the way at the same time for equality in servitude. Note 49. Example of the manner in which the courts expressed themselves upon the occasion of certain arbitrary acts. It appears, from a memorial laid before the Contrôleur General in 1781, by the Intendant of the Generalite of Paris, that it was one of the customs of that Generalite that the parishes should have two syndics, the one elected by the inhabitants in an assembly presided over by the subdelegate, the other chosen by the intendant, and considered the overseer of the former. A quarrel took place between the two syndics in the parish of Roule, the elected syndic not choosing to obey the chosen syndic. The intendant, by means of M. de Breteuil, had the elected syndic put into the prison of La Force for a fortnight. He was arrested, then dismissed from his post, and another was put in his place. Thereupon the Parliament, upon the requisition of the imprisoned syndic, commenced proceedings at law, the issue of which I have not been able to find, but during which it declared that the imprisonment of the plaintiff and the nullification of his election could only be considered as arbitrary and despotic acts. The judicial authorities, it seems, were then sometimes rather hard in the mouth. Note 50. So far from being the case that the enlightened and wealthy classes were oppressed and enslaved under the Ancien Regime, it may be said, on the contrary, that all, including the bourgeoisie, were frequently far too free to do all they liked. Since the royal authority did not dare to prevent members of these classes from constantly creating themselves an exceptional position, to the detriment of the people, and almost always considered it necessary to sacrifice the latter to them, in order to obtain their goodwill, or put a stop to their ill humor. It may be said that, in the 18th century, a Frenchman belonging to these classes could more easily resist the government, and force it to use conciliatory measures with him, than an Englishman of the same position in life could have done at that time. The authorities often considered themselves obliged to use toward such a man a far more temporizing and timid policy than the English government would ever have thought itself bound to employ towards an English subject in the same category. So wrong is it to confound independence with liberty. Nothing is less independent than a free citizen. Note 51. Reason that frequently obliged the absolute government in the ancient state of society to restrain itself. In ordinary times the augmentation of old taxes, and more especially the imposition of new taxes, are the only subjects likely to cause trouble to a government, or excite a people. Under the old financial constitution of Europe, when any prince had expensive desires, or plunged into an adventurous line of policy, or allowed his finances to become disordered, or, to take another instance, needed money for the purpose of sustaining himself by winning partisans by means of enormous gains or heavy salaries that they had never earned, or by keeping up numerous armies, by undertaking great public works, and he was obliged at once to have recourse to taxation, a proceeding that immediately roused and excited every class, especially that class which creates revolutions, the people. Nowadays, in similar positions, loans are contracted, the immediate effect of which passes almost unperceived, and the final result of which is only felt by the succeeding generation. Note 52. As one example, among many others, the fact may be cited, that the principal domains in the jurisdiction of Mayenne were farmed out to fermiers généraux, who took as sous-fermiers little miserable tillers of land, who had nothing of their own, and for whom they were obliged to furnish the most necessary farming utensils. It may be well conceived that fermiers généraux of this kind had no great consideration for the farmers or due-paying tenants of the old feudal seigneur, who had put them in his place, and that the exercise of feudalism in such hands as these was often more hard to bear than in the Middle Ages. Note 53. Another example. The inhabitants of Montbazon had put upon the Taille the stewards of the duchy, which was in possession of the Prince de Rohan, although these stewards only farmed in his name. This prince, who must have been extremely wealthy, not only caused this abuse, as he termed it, to be put a stop to, but obtained the reimbursement of 5,344 livres 15 sous, which he had been improperly made to pay, and which was charged upon the inhabitants. Note 54. Example of the manner in which the pecuniary claims of the clergy alienated from them the hearts of those whose isolated position ought to have conciliated them. The cure of Noisy asserted that the inhabitants were obliged to undertake the repairs of his barn and winepress, and asked for the imposition of a local tax for that purpose. The intendant gave answer that the inhabitants were only obliged to repair the parsonage house, and that the barn and winepress were to be at the expense of this pastor, who was evidently more busied about the affairs of his farm than his spiritual flock. 1767. Note 55. In one of the memorials sent up in 1788 by the peasants, a memorial written with much clearness and in a moderate tone. In answer to an inquiry instituted by a provincial assembly, the following passages occur: in addition to the abuses occasioned by the mode of levying the taille, there exists that of the garnissaires. These men generally arrive 5 times during the collection of the taille. They are commonly invalids, or Swiss soldiers. They remain every time 4 or 5 days in the parish, and are taxed at 36 sous a day by the tax receipt office. As to the assessment of the taille, we will forbear to point out the 2 well-known abuses occasioned by the arbitrary measures employed and the bad effects produced by the officious parts played by officers who are frequently incapable and almost always partial and vindictive. They have been the cause, however, of many disturbances and quarrels, and have occasioned proceedings at law, extremely expensive for the parties pleading, and very advantageous to the courts. Note 56. The superiority of the methods adopted in the provinces possessing assemblies, pays d'état, recognized by the government functionaries themselves. A confidential letter, written by the director of the taxes to the intendant, on June 3, 1772, has the following: in the pays d'états, the tax being a fixed tantiem, percentage, every taxpayer is subject to it, and really pays it. An augmentation upon this tantiem is made in the assessment, in proportion to the augmentation required by the king upon the total supplied, for instance, 1,000,000 instead of 900,000 livres. This is a simple operation. Whilst in the generalite the assessment is personal, and, so to say, arbitrary, some pay their due, others only the half, others the third, the quarter, or nothing at all. How, in this case, subject the amount of taxation to the augmentation of 1/9? Note 57. The manner in which the privileged classes understood at first the progress of civilization in road-making. Count X, in a letter to the intendant, complains of the very little zeal shown in the establishment of a road in his neighborhood. He says it is the fault of the subdelic who does not use sufficient energy in the exercise of his functions, and will not compel the peasants to do their forced labor, corvées. Note 58. Arbitrary imprisonment for the corvée. An example is given in a letter of a grand prevot, in 1768, I ordered yesterday, it says, the imprisonment of 3 men, at the demand of M.C., sub-engineer, for not having done their corvée. Upon which there was a considerable agitation among the women of the village, who exclaimed, the poor people are thought of quite enough when the corvée is to be done, but nobody takes care to see they have enough to live upon. Note 59. The resources for the making of roads were of 2 kinds. The greater was the corvée, for all the great works that required only labor. The smaller was derived from the general taxation, the amount of which was placed at the disposition of the ponts et chaussées for the expenses of works requiring science. The privileged classes, that is to say, the principal landowners, though more interested than all in the construction of roads, contributed nothing to the corvée and, moreover, were still exempt otherwise. Inasmuch as the taxation for the ponts et chaussées was annexed to the taille, and levied in the same manner. Note 60. Example of forced labor in the transport of convicts. It may be seen by a letter, addressed by a commissary at the head of the police department of convict gangs, to the intendant, in 1761, that the peasants were compelled to cart the galley slaves on their way. That they executed this task with very ill will. And that they were frequently maltreated by the convict guards, inasmuch, says the commissary, as the guards are coarse and brutal fellows, and the peasants who undertake this work by compulsion are often insolent. Note 61. Turgot has given descriptions of the inconvenience and hardship of forced labor for the transport of military baggage, which, after a perusal of the office papers, appear not to have been exaggerated. Among other things, he says that its chief hardship consisted in the unequal distribution of a very heavy burden, inasmuch as it fell entirely upon a small number of parishes, which had the misfortune of being placed on the high road. The distance to be done was often one of 5, 6, or sometimes 10 and 15 leagues. In which case 3 days were necessary for the journey out and home again. The compensation given to the landowners only amounted to 1/5 of the expense that fell upon them. The period when forced labor was required was generally the summer, the time of harvest. The oxen were almost always overdriven, and frequently fell ill after having been employed at the work, so much so that a great number of landowners preferred giving a sum of 15 to 20 livres rather than supply a wagon and 4 oxen. The consequent confusion which took place was unavoidable. The peasants were constantly exposed to violence of treatment from the military. The officers almost always demanded more than was their due. And sometimes they obliged the drivers, by force, to harness saddle horses to the vehicles at the risk of doing them a serious injury. Sometimes the soldiers insisted upon riding upon carts already overloaded. At other times, impatient at the slow progress of the oxen, they goaded them with their swords, and when the peasants remonstrated they were maltreated. Note 62. Example of the manner in which forced labor was applied to everything. A correspondence arising, upon a complaint made by the intendant of the naval department at Rochefort, concerning the difficulties made by the peasants who were obliged by the corvée to cart the wood purchased by the navy contractors in the different provinces for the purposes of shipbuilding, shows that the peasants were in truth still, 1775, obliged to do this forced labor, the price of which the intendant himself fixed. The minister of the navy transferred the complaint to the intendant of Tours, with the order that he must see to the supply of the carriages required. The intendant, M. de Clouzal, refused to authorize this species of forced labor, whereupon the minister wrote him a threatening letter, telling him that he would have to answer for his refusal to the king. The intendant, to this, replied at once, December 11, 1775, with firmness, that, during the 10 years he had been intendant at Tours, he never had chosen to authorize these corvées, on account of the inevitable abuses resulting from them, for which the price fixed for the use of the vehicles was no compensation. For frequently, says his letter, the animals are crippled by the weight of the enormous masses they are obliged to drag through roads as bad as the time of year when they are ordered out. What encouraged the intendant in his resistance seems to have been a letter of M. Turgot, which is annexed to the papers on this matter. It is dated on July 30, 1774, shortly after his becoming minister. And it says that he himself never authorized these corvées at Limoges, and approves of M. de Clouzal for not authorizing them at Tours. It is proved by some portions of this correspondence that the timber contractors frequently exacted this forced labor even when they were, 288, not authorized to do so by the contracts made between themselves and the state. Inasmuch as they thus profited at least 1/3 in the economy of their transport expenses. An example of the profit thus obtained is given by a subdelic in the following computation: distance of the transport of the wood from the spot where it is cut to the river, by almost impracticable crossroads, 6 leagues. Time employed in going and coming back, 2 days. Reckoning, as an indemnity to the corvables, the square foot at the rate of 6 liards a league, the whole amounts to 13 francs 10 sous for the journey, a sum scarcely sufficient to pay the actual expenses of the small landowner, of his assistant, and of the oxen or horses harnessed to his cart. His own time and trouble, and the work of his beasts, are dead losses to him. On May 17, 1776, the intendant was served by the minister with a positive order from the king to have this corvée executed. M. de Clouzot being then dead, his successor, M. L'Escalopier, very readily obeyed, and published an ordinance declaring that the subdelic had to make the assessment of the amount of labor to be levied upon each parish. In consequence of which the different persons obliged to statute labor in the said parishes were constrained to go, according to the time and place set forth by the syndics, to the spot where the wood might happen to be, and cart it at the price regulated by the subdelic. Note 63. Example of the manner in which the peasants were often treated. In 1768 the king allowed a remittance of 2,000 francs to be made upon the taille in the parish of Chapelle-Blanche, near Saumur. The cure wanted to appropriate a part of this sum to the construction of a belfry, in order to get rid of the sound of the bells that annoyed him, as he said, in his parsonage house. The inhabitants complained and resisted. The subdelic took part with the cure, and had 3 of the principal inhabitants arrested during the night and put into prison. Further examples may be found in a royal order to imprison for a fortnight a woman who had insulted 2 of the mounted rural police, and another order for the imprisonment for a fortnight of a stocking weaver who had spoken ill of the same police. In this latter case the intendant replied to the minister, that he had already put the man in prison, a proceeding that met with the approval of the minister. This abuse of the monarchy had arisen from the fact of the violent arrest of several beggars, that seems to have greatly shocked the population. The subdelic, it appears, in arresting the weaver, made publicly known that all who should continue to insult the monarchy should be even still more severely punished. It appears by the correspondence between the subdelic and their intendant, 1760 to 1770, that orders were given by him to them to have all ill-doing persons arrested, not to be tried, but to be punished forthwith by imprisonment. In one instance the subdelic asks leave of the intendant to condemn to perpetual imprisonment 2 dangerous beggars whom he had arrested. In another we find the protest of a father against the arrest of his son as a vagabond, because he was traveling without his passport. Again, a householder of X demands the arrest of a man, one of his neighbors, who had come to establish himself in the parish, to whom he had been of service, but who had behaved ill, and was disagreeable to him. And the intendant of Paris writes to request the intendant of Rouen to be kind enough to render this service to the householder, who is one of his friends. In another case an intendant replies to a person who wants to have some beggars set at liberty, saying that the depot de mendicants was not to be considered as a prison, but only as a house intended for the detention of beggars and vagabonds. As an administrative correction. This idea has come down to the French penal code, so much have the traditions of the old monarchy, in these matters, maintained themselves. Note 64. It has been said that the character of the philosophy of the 18th century was a sort of adoration of human reason, a boundless confidence in its almighty power to transform at its will laws, institutions, and morals. But, upon examination, we shall see that, in truth, it was more their own reason that some of these philosophers adored than human reason. None ever showed less confidence in the wisdom of mankind than these men. I could name many who had almost as much contempt for the masses as for the divinity. The latter they treated with the arrogance of rivals, the former with the arrogance of upstarts. A real and respectful submission to the will of the majority was as far from their minds as submission to the divine will. Almost all the revolutionists of after days have displayed this double character. There is a wide distance between their disposition and the respect shown by the English and Americans to the opinion of the majority of their fellow citizens. Individual reason in those countries has its own pride and confidence in itself, but is never insolent. It has thus led the way to freedom, whilst in France it has done nothing but invent new forms of servitude. Note 65. Frederick the Great, in his memoirs, has said, "Your great men, such as Fontenelle, Voltaire, Hobbes, Collins, Shaftesbury, Bolingbroke, have struck a mortal blow at religion. Men began to look into that which they had blindly adored. Reason overthrew superstition, disgust for all the fables they had believed succeeded. Deism acquired many followers. As Epicureanism became fatal to the idolatrous worship of the heathen, so did deism in our days to the Judaical visions adopted by our forefathers. The freedom of opinion prevalent in England contributed greatly to the progress of philosophy. It may be seen by the above passage that Frederick the Great, at the time he wrote those lines, that is to say, in the middle of the 18th century, still at that time looked upon England as the seat of irreligious doctrines. But a still more striking fact may be gathered from it, namely, that one of the sovereigns, the most experienced in the knowledge of man, and of affairs in general, does not appear to have the slightest idea of the political utility of religion. The errors of judgment in the mind of his instructors had evidently disordered the natural qualities of his own. Note 66. The spirit of progress which showed itself in France at the end of the 18th century appeared at the same time throughout all Germany, and was everywhere accompanied by the same desire to change the institutions of the time. A German historian gives the following picture of what was then going on in his own country. In the second half of the 18th century the new spirit of the age gradually introduced itself even into the ecclesiastical territories. Reforms were begun in them, industry and tolerance made their way in them on every side, and that enlightened absolutism, which had already taken possession of the large states, penetrated even there. It must be said at the same time, that at no period of the 18th century had these ecclesiastical territories possessed such remarkable and estimable princes as during the last 10 years preceding the French Revolution. The resemblance of this picture to that which France then offered is remarkable. In France, the movement in favor of amelioration and progress began at the same epoch. And the men the most able to govern appeared on the stage just at the time when the revolution was about to swallow up everything. It must be observed also how much all that portion of Germany was visibly hurried on by the movement of civilization and political progress in France. Note 67. The laws of England prove that it is possible for institutions to be full of defects and yet not prevent the accomplishment of the principal end and aim for which they were established. The power, which nations possess, of prospering in spite of the imperfections to be met with in secondary portions of their institutions. As long as the general principles and the actual spirit which animate those institutions are full of life and vigor, is a phenomenon which manifests itself with peculiar distinctness when the judicial constitution of England in the last century, as described by Blackstone, is looked into. The attention is immediately arrested by two great diversities, that are very striking. First, the diversity of the laws. Secondly, the diversity of the courts that administer them. Diversity of the laws. 1. The laws are different for England, properly so called, for Scotland, for Ireland, for the different European dependencies of Great Britain, such as the Isle of Man, the Channel Islands, and, finally, for the British colonies. 2. In England itself may be found 4 kinds of laws: the common law, statute laws, canon law, and equity. The common law is itself divided into general customs adopted throughout the whole kingdom, and customs specially belonging to certain manors or certain towns, or sometimes only to certain classes, such as the trades. These customs sometimes differ greatly from each other. As those, for instance, which, in opposition to the general tendency of the English laws require an equal distribution of property among all the children, gavel kind, and, what is still more singular, give a right of primogeniture to the youngest child, borough English. 2. Diversity of the courts. Blackstone informs us that the law has instituted a prodigious variety of different courts. Some idea of this may be obtained from the following extremely summary analysis. 1. In the first place there were the courts established without the limits of England, properly so called. Such as the Scotch and Irish courts, which never were dependencies of the superior courts in England, although an appeal lies from these several jurisdictions to the House of Lords. 2. In England itself, if I am correct in my memory, among the classifications of Blackstone are to be found the following. 1. 11 kinds of courts of common law, 4 of which, it is true, seem to have already fallen into disuse. 2. 3 kinds of courts, the jurisdiction of which extends to the whole country, but which take cognizance only of certain matters. 3. 10 kinds of courts, having a special character of their own. One of these kinds consists of local courts, established by different acts of Parliament, and existing by tradition, either in London itself or in towns and boroughs in the counties. These courts were so numerous, and were so extremely various in their constitution and in their regulations, that it would be out of the question to attempt to give a detailed account of them. Thus, in England, properly so called, alone, if Blackstone is to be believed, there existed, at the period when he wrote, that is to say, in the second half of the 18th century, 24 kinds of courts. Several of which were subdivided into a great number of individual courts, each of which had its special peculiarities. If we set aside those kinds, which appear at that time to have almost fallen into disuse, we shall then find 18 or 20. If now the judicial system in itself be examined, it will be found to contain all sorts of imperfections. In spite of the multiplicity of the courts, there was frequently a want of smaller courts, of primary instance, placed within the reach of those concerned, and empowered to judge on the spot, and at little expense, all minor matters. This want rendered such legal proceedings perplexing and expensive. The same matters came under the jurisdiction of several courts, and thus an embarrassing uncertainty hung over the commencements of legal proceedings. Some of the appeal courts were also courts of original jurisdiction, sometimes the courts of common law, at other times the courts of equity. There was a great diversity of appeal courts. The only central point was that of the House of Lords. The administrative litigant was not separated from the ordinary litigant, a fact which, in the eyes of most French legal men, would appear a monstrous anomaly. All these courts, moreover, looked for the grounds of their judgments in 4 different kinds of legislation. That of the courts of equity was established upon practice and tradition, since its very object was most frequently to go against custom and statute, and to correct, by the rules of the system framed by the judges in equity, all that was antiquated or too harsh in statute and custom. These blemishes were very great. And if the enormous old machine of the English judicial system be compared with the modern construction of that of France, and the simplicity, consistence, and natural connexity to be observed in the latter, with the remarkable complication and incoherence of the former, the errors of the English jurisprudence will appear greater still. Yet there is not a country in the world in which, in the days of Blackstone, the great ends of justice are more completely attained than in England. That is to say, no country in which every man, whatever his condition of life, whether he appeared in court as a common individual or a prince, was more sure of being heard, or found in the tribunals of his country better guarantees for the defense of his property, his liberty, and his life. It is not meant by this that the defects of the English judicial system were of any service to what I have here called the great ends of justice. It proves only that in every judicial organization there are secondary defects that are only partially injurious to these ends of justice, and other principal ones, that not only prove injurious to them, but destroy them altogether, although joined to many secondary perfections. The first mentioned are the most easily perceived. They are the defects that generally first strike common minds, they stare one in the face, as the saying goes. The others are often more concealed. And it is not always the men the most learned in the law, and other men in the profession, who discover them and point them out. It must be observed, moreover, that the same qualities may be either secondary or principal, according to the period of history or the political organization of a country. In periods of aristocratic predominance and inequality, everything that tends to lessen any privilege of any individual before the face of justice, to afford guarantees to the weak against the strong, and to give a predominance to the action of the state, which is naturally impartial in differences only occurring between subjects, becomes a principal quality. Whereas it diminishes in importance in proportion to the inclination of the social state and political constitution towards democracy. In studying the English judicial system upon these principles, it will be found that, although it permitted the existence of every defect that could contribute to render justice in that country obscure, hampered, slow, expensive, and inconvenient, it had taken infinite precautions to prevent the strong from ever being favored at the expense of the weak, or the state at the expense of the private individual. The more the observer penetrates into the details of the English legislation, the more he will see that every citizen was provided with all sorts of weapons for his defense. And that matters were so arranged as to afford to everyone the greatest number of guarantees possible against partiality, actual venality, and that sort of venality which is more common, and especially more dangerous in democratic times, the venality consisting of the servility of the courts towards the government. In this point of view, the English judicial system, in spite of the numerous secondary errors that may still be found in it, appears to me superior to the French, which, although almost entirely untainted, it is true, by any one of these defects, does not at the same time offer in like degree the principal qualities that are to be found in it, which, although excellent in the guarantees it affords to every citizen in all disputes between individuals, fails precisely in that point that ought always to be strengthened in a democratic state of society like the French, namely, in the guarantees afforded to individuals against the state. Note 68. Advantages enjoyed by the Generalite of Paris. This Generalite was as much favored in charities bestowed by the government as it was in the levying of taxes. An example may be found in a letter of the Contrôleur General to the Intendant of the Generalite of the Isle de France, dated May 22, 1787, in which he informs the latter that the king had fixed the sum which was to be employed upon works of charity during the year, in the Generalite of Paris, at 172,800 livres. And 100,000 livres, moreover, were destined for the purchase of cows, to be given to different husbandmen. It may be seen by this letter that the sum of 172,000 livres was to be distributed by the intendant alone, with the proviso that he was to conform himself to the general rules already made known to him by the government, and that he was to lay the account of the distribution before the Contrôleur General for approval. Note 69. The administration of the old monarchy was made up of a multitude of different powers, which had been established at different times, but generally for the purposes of the treasury, and not of the administration, properly so called, and which frequently had the same field of action. It was thus impossible to avoid confusion and contention otherwise than by each party acting but little, or even doing nothing at all. As soon as they made any efforts to rise above this sort of languor, they hampered and entangled each other's movements. And thus it happened that the complaints made against the complication of the administrative machinery, and the confusion as to its different attributions, were very much more grievous during the years that immediately preceded the Revolution than 30 or 40 years before. The political institutions of the country had not become worse, on the contrary, they had been greatly ameliorated, but the general political movement had become much more active. Note 70. Arbitrary augmentation of the taxes. What was here said by the king respecting the taille might have been said by him, with as much reason, concerning the vingtiemes. As may be seen by the following correspondence, in 1772 the Contrôleur General Terraille had decided upon a considerable augmentation, as much as 100,000 livres, upon the vingtiemes of the Generalite of Tours. It is evident that this measure caused M. de Clozel, an able administrator and an honorable man, both sorrow and embarrassment. For, in a confidential letter, he says, it is probably the facility with which the 200,000 livres, a previous augmentation, have been given, that has encouraged the cruel interpretation and the letter of the month of June. In a private and confidential letter, which the Director of Contributions wrote thereupon to the Intendant, he says, if the augmentations which have been demanded appear to you, on account of the general distress, to be as aggravating and as revolting as you give me to understand, it would be better for the province, which can have no other defense or protection than in your generous good feeling, that you should spare it, at least, the rolls de supplement. A retroactive tax, that is always odious. It may be seen by this correspondence what a complete absence there was of any solid basis, and what arbitrary measures were exercised, each with honest intentions. Both minister and intendant laid the weight of the increased taxation sometimes upon the agricultural rather than the manufacturing interests, sometimes upon one kind of agriculture more than another, as the growth of vines, for instance, according as they fancied that the manufacturing or any one branch of the agricultural interest ought to be more tenderly handled. Note 71. Expressions used by Turgot respecting the country people in the preamble of a royal declaration. The rural communities consist, throughout the greater part of the kingdom, of poor peasants, who are ignorant and brutal, and incapable of self-administration. Note 72. How it was that revolutionary ideas naturally sprang up in men's minds, even under the old monarchy. In 1779 an avocat addressed a petition to the council for a decree to establish a maximum of the price of straw throughout the whole kingdom. Note 73. The head engineer, in a letter written to the intendant, in 1781, relative to a demand for an increase of indemnification, thus expresses himself: the claimant does not pay heed to the fact that the indemnifications granted are an especial favor to the generalite of Tours, and that people ought to consider themselves very fortunate in recovering only a part of their loss. If such compensations as the claimant requires were to be given, for millions would not suffice. Note 74. The revolution did not break out on account of this prosperity, but that active, uneasy, intelligent, innovating, ambitious spirit that was destined to produce the revolution, the democratic spirit of new states of society, began to stir up everything, and, before it overthrew for a period the social state of France, was already strong enough to agitate and develop it. Note 75. Collision of the different administrative powers in 1787. The following may be taken as an example. The Intermediate Commission of the Provincial Assembly of the Île-de-France claimed the administration of the Dépôt de Mendicite. The intendant insisted upon its remaining in his own hands, inasmuch, said he, as this establishment is not kept up by the funds of the province. During the discussion, the Intermediate Commission communicated with the Intermediate Commissions of other provinces, in order to learn their opinions. Among other answers given to its questions, exists one from the Intermediate Commission of Champagne, informing that of the Île-de-France that it had met with the very same difficulties, and had offered the same resistance. Note 76. In the minutes of the First Provincial Assembly of the Île-de-France, the following declaration may be found, proceeding from the mouth of the reporter of the committee: up to the present time the functions of syndic, which are far more onerous than honorable, are such as to indispose from accepting them all those who unite a sufficient competency to the intelligence to be expected from their position in life. Note 77. Feudal rights, which still existed at the period of the Revolution, according to the feudal lawyers. It is not the intention of the author here to write a treatise upon feudal rights, and, least of all, to attempt any research into their possible origin. It is simply his desire to point out those which were still exercised in the 18th century. These rights played so important a part at that time, and have since retained so large a space in the imagination of the very persons who have no longer anything to suffer from them, that it was a most interesting task to find out precisely what they were when the Revolution destroyed them all. For this purpose a great number of terriers, or rolls of feudal manners, were studied, those of the most recent date being selected. But this manner of proceeding led to nothing. For the feudal rights, although regulated by a legal code, which was the same throughout the whole of feudal Europe, were infinitely various in their kinds, according to the province, or even the districts, where they existed. The only system, then, which appeared likely to lead, in an approximate manner, to the required result, was the following: these feudal rights were continually giving rise to all sorts of disputes and litigation. In these cases it was necessary to know how these rights were acquired, how they were lost, in what they consisted exactly, which were the dues that could only be collected by virtue of a royal patent, which those that could only be established by private title, which those on the contrary that had no need of formal titles, and might be collected upon the strength of local custom, or even in virtue of long usage. Again, when they were for sale, it was necessary to know in what manner they were to be valued, and what capital each of them represented, according to its importance. All these points, so immediately affecting 1,000 pecuniary interests, were subject to litigation, and thus was constituted a distinct class of legal men, whose only occupation it was to elucidate them. Many of these men wrote during the second half of the 18th century, some even just upon the threshold of the Revolution. They were not lawyers, properly speaking, but practitioners, whose only task it was to point out to professional men the rules to be followed in this special and little attractive portion of legal science. By an attentive study of these feudistes, a tolerably minute and distinct idea of a subject, the size and confusion of which is at first bewildering, may be at last come at. The author gives below the most succinct summary he was able to make of his work. These notes are principally derived from the work of Edme de Fremonville, who wrote about the year 1750, and from that of Rinaldin, written in 1765, and entitled Trait historique et pratique des droits seigneuriaux. The cens, that is to say, the perpetual quit-rent, in kind and in money, which, by the feudal laws, was affixed to the possession of certain lands, still, in the 18th century, affected most deeply the position of a great number of landed proprietors. This cens continued to be indivisible, that is to say, the entire cens might be claimed of any one of the possessors of the property, subject to the cens at will. It was always irredeemable. No proprietor of any lands, subject to the cens, could sell them without being exposed to the retrait sensual, that is to say, without being obliged to let the property be taken back at the price of the sale. But this only took place in certain coutumes. The coutume of Paris, which was the most general, did not recognize this right. Lauds et ventes. It was a general rule that, in every part of the country where the coutume prevailed, the sale of every estate subject to the cens should produce what were called lauds et ventes. In other words, the fines paid to the lords of the manor, upon the alienation of this kind of property. These dues were more or less considerable, according to the customs of the manor, but were everywhere considerable enough. They existed just as well in parts where the droit écrit, written law, was established. They generally consisted of 1/6 of the price, and were then named lauds. But in these parts the lord of the manor had to establish his rights. In what was called pays écrit, as well as in pays coutumier, the cens gave the lord of the manor a privilege which took precedence of all other debts on the estate. Terrage or champart. Agrier. Task. These dues consisted of a certain portion of the produce, which the lord of the manor levied upon lands subject to the cens. The amount varied according to the contracts or the customs of the place. This right is frequently to be met with in the 18th century. I believe that the terrage, even in pays coutumier, could only be claimed under express deed. The terrage was either seigneurial or foncier. It is not necessary to explain here the distinctions which existed between these two different kinds. Suffice it to say that the terrage foncier was fixed for 30 years, like the rente fonciers, whilst the terrage seigneurial was irredeemable. Land subject to terrage could not be mortgaged without the consent of the lord of the manor. Bordelage. A right which only existed in the Nivernais and Bourbonnais countries, and which consisted in an annual quit-rent, paid in money, corn, and fowls, upon lands subject to the cens. This right entailed very rigorous consequences. Non-payment of the dues during 3 years gave cause for the exercise of the commise or entry to the advantage of the lord of the manor. A tenant owing the bordelage was more open than any other to a variety of annoyances on his property. Sometimes the lord of the manor possessed the right of claiming his inheritance, even when he died having heirs who had legal rights to the succession. This was the most rigorous of any of the feudal rights. And the law had finally restricted it only to rural inheritances. For, as our author says, the peasant is always the mule ready to bear every burden. Marciage was the name of peculiar dues levied upon the possessors of land, subject to the cens, in very few places, and consisting in certain payments due only upon the natural death of the lord of the manor. Dimes in fiefs. There still existed in the 18th century a great number of tithes in fief. They were generally established by separate contract, and did not result from the mere fact of the lordship of the manor. Parciere. The parcières were dues levied upon the crops of fruit gathered on the manor lands. They bore resemblance to the champart and the dime in fiefs, and were principally in usage in the Bourbonnais and Auvergne countries. Carpot. This was observed in the Bourbonnais country, and was a due levied upon the vineyards, as the champart was upon arable lands, that is to say, it was levied upon a portion of the crops. It amounted to a quarter of the vintage. Servage. The customs that still possessed traces of serfdom were called coutumes serves. They were very few in number. In the provinces where they were still observed there were no estates, or at least very few, where some traces of ancient serfdom were not visible. This remark is derived from a work written in 1765. The servage, or, as the author terms it, the servitude, was either personal or real. The personal servitude was attached to the person, and followed him everywhere. Wherever the serf might go, to whatever place he might transport his substance, he might be reclaimed by the lord by right of suite. Our authors cite several legal verdicts that establish this right, among others, a verdict given on the June 17, 1760. In which the court decides against a seigneur of the Nivernais in respect to his right of claiming the succession of Pierre Truchet, who was the son of a serf subject to Poursuite, according to the custom of the Nivernais, who had married a Parisian woman, and who had died in Paris, as well as his son. But this verdict seems to have been founded on the fact that Paris was a place of refuge, lieu d'asile, in which the suite could not take place. If the right of asile alone prevented the seigneur from seizing upon property possessed by his serfs in the lieu d'asile, it formed no opposition against his claiming to succeed to property left in his own manor. The real servitude resulted from the occupation of land, and might cease upon the land being given up or residence in a certain place changed. Corvées. The right possessed by the lord of the manor over his subjects, by means of which he could employ for his own profit a certain number of their days of labor, or of their oxen and horses. The corvée à volant, that is to say, at the arbitrary will of the seigneur, had been completely abolished. Forced labor had been for some time past confined to a certain number of days a year. The corvée might be either personal or real. The personal corvées were paid by laborers and workmen, whose residence was established upon the manor, each according to his occupation. The real corvées were attached to the possession of certain lands. Nobles, ecclesiastics, clerical personages, officers of justice, advocates, physicians, notaries, and bankers, and men in that position of life, were exempt from the corvée. A verdict, given on the August 13, 1735, is cited by one of our authors, exempting a notary whom his seigneur wanted to force to come for nothing, during 3 days. And draw up certain law papers concerning the seigneury on which the notary resided. Another verdict, of the date of 1750, decides that, when the corvée is personal, it may be paid either in person or by money, the choice to be left to the person by whom it is due. Every corvée had to be established by written title deeds. The corvée seigneuriale had become extremely rare in the 18th century. Banalites. Rights possessed by the lords of certain manors to oblige those residing on them to make use of his baking office, mill, and, upon payment. The provinces of Flanders, Artois, and Hainaut were alone exempt from banalites. The custom of Paris rigorously requires that this should not be exercised without written title. Every person domiciled within the circuit of the banalite was subject to it, and, most generally, even the nobles and priests also. Besides the banalite of the winepress and baking office there existed several others. 1. Banalites of industrial establishments, such as for cloth, tanning, or hemp. This banalite is established by many coutumes, as for instance, by those of Anjou, the Maine, and Brittany. 2. Banalites of the winepress. Few coutumes mention this. But that of Lorraine, as well as that of the Maine, establish it. 3. Banalite of the manor bull. No coutumes mention this, but there were title deeds that established the right. The same may be said of the right of banalite for butchers' shambles. In general these latter banalites of which we have just spoken were more uncommon, and looked upon with a still less favorable eye than the others. They could only be exercised by the clearest declaration of the coutumes, or, where that was wanting, by the most precise title. Ban de vendanges. This was still practiced throughout the whole of the kingdom in the 18th century. It was a simple right of police attached to the right of haute justice. In order to exercise it, the seigneur, who was haute justicier, did not need to possess any other title. The ban of vendanges was obligatory upon everybody. The coutumes of Burgundy give the seigneur the right of gathering in his vintage a day before any other vine proprietor. Droit de ban vin. This was a right still possessed by a quantity of seigneurs, as our authors have it, either by custom or special title, to sell the wine grown upon their manors for a certain period of time, in general a month or 40 days, before any one else. Among the grandes coutumes those of Tours, Anjou, the Maine, and La Marque alone established it, and had regulations for it. A verdict of the Cour des Aides, dated August 28, 1751, authorizes publicans, as an exception to the common rule, to sell wine during the ban vin, but this must have referred only to the wine of the seigneur, made from that year's growth. The coutumes that establish and regulate the right of ban vin generally require that it should be founded upon legal title. Droit de blairy was a right belonging to the seigneur, who was haut justicier, to grant permission to the inhabitants to have their cattle graze upon lands situated throughout his jurisdiction, or upon waste lands. This right did not exist in any parts regulated by droit écrit, but it was common enough in those where the droit coutumier was in force. It was to be found under different denominations, more particularly in the Bourbonnais, the Nivernais, Auvergne, and Burgundy. This right rested upon the supposition that the whole territory originally belonged to the seigneur, in such wise that, after the distribution of the greater part into fiefs, censites, and other concessions of lands upon quit rents, there still remained portions which could only be used for waste pasture ground, and of which he might grant the temporary use to others. The blairy was established in several coutumes, but it could only be claimed by a seigneur who was haut justicier, and was maintained only by some special title, or at least by old claims supported by long possession. Pages. According to our authors, there originally existed a prodigious number of manorial tolls upon bridges, rivers, and roads. Louis XIV did away with a great number of them. In 1724 a commission, nominated to examine into the titles by which the tolls were claimed, suppressed 1,200 of them, and, in 1765, they were still being constantly suppressed. The principle observed in this respect, says Rinaldon, was that, inasmuch as the toll was a tax, it was necessary to be founded not only upon legal title, but upon one emanating from the sovereign. The toll was levied de par le roi. One of the conditions of the toll was that it should be established by tariff regulating the dues, which each kind of merchandise had to pay. It was necessary that this tariff should be approved by a decree of the council. The title of concession, says one author, had to be followed by uninterrupted possession. In spite of these precautions legally taken, it appears that the value of the tolls had greatly increased in later times. I know one toll, says the same author, that was farmed out, a century ago, at 100 livres, and now brings in 1,400, and another, farmed at 39,000 livres, that brings in 90,000. The principal ordinances or principal decrees that regulated the right of toll, were paragraph 29 of the Ordinance of 1669, and the decrees of 1683, 1693, 1724, 1775. The authors I have quoted, although in general favorable enough to feudal rights, acknowledge that great abuses were committed in the levying of the tolls. The right of ferries differed materially from the right of toll. The latter was only levied upon merchandise, the former upon individuals, animals, and carriages. It was necessary that this right, in order to be exercised, should likewise be authorized by the king. And the dues, to be levied, had to be fixed by the same decree of council that established and authorized it. Droit de l'aide, to which many other names have been given in different places, was a tax levied upon merchandise brought to fairs and markets. Many lords of the manor, as appears by our feudistes, considered this right as one attached to the right of haute justice, and wholly manorial, but quite mistakenly, inasmuch as it could only be authorized by the king. At all events, this right only belonged to the seigneur, who was haut justicier. He levied the police fines, to which the exercise of the right gave occasion. It appears, however, that, although by theory the droit de l'aide could only emanate from the king, it was frequently set up solely upon the basis of feudal title or long possession. It is very certain that fairs could not be established otherwise than by royal authorization. The lords of the manor, however, had no need of any precise title, or any concession on the part of the king, for the exercise of the right of regulating the weights and measures to be used by their vassals in all fairs and markets held upon the manor. It was enough for the right to be founded upon custom and constant possession. Our authors say that all the kings, who, one after the other, were desirous of re-establishing uniformity in the weights and measures, failed in the attempt. Matters had been allowed to remain at the same point where they were when the old coutumes were drawn up. Chemins. Rights exercised by the lords of the manor upon roads. The high roads, called chemins du roi, king's highway, belonged, in fact, to the sovereigns alone. Their formation, their reparation, and the offences committed upon them, were beyond the cognizance of the seigneurs or their judges. The by-roads, to be met with on any portion of a seigneury, doubtless belonged to such seigneurs as were Hautes Justiciers. They had all the rights of voirie and police upon them, and their judges took cognizance of all the offences committed upon them, except in royal cases. At an earlier period the seigneurs had been obliged to keep up the high roads passing through their seigneury, and, as a compensation for the expenses incurred in these repairs, they were allowed the dues arising from tolls, settlement of boundaries, and barriers. But, at this epoch, the king had resumed the general direction of the high roads. Os. All the rivers, both navigable and floatable, admitting the passage of rafts, belonged to the king, although they flowed through the property of lords of the manor, and in spite of any title to the contrary. See Ordinance of 1669. If the lords of the manor levied any dues upon these rivers, it was those arising from the rights of fishing, the mills, ferry boats, and bridge tolls, and, in virtue of concessions emanating only from the king. There were some lords of the manor who still arrogated to themselves the rights of jurisdiction and police upon these rivers, but this manifestly only arose from usurpation, or from concessions improperly acquired. The smaller rivers unquestionably belonged to the seigneurs through whose property they flowed. They possessed in them the same rights of property, of jurisdiction, and police, which the king possessed upon the navigable rivers. All seigneurs Hautes Justiciers were universally the lords of the non-navigable rivers running through their territory. They wanted no other legal title for the exercise of their claims than that which conferred the right of haute justice. There were some customs, such as the coutume du barry, that authorized private individuals to erect a mill upon the seigneurial river passing through the lands they occupied, without the permission of the seigneur. The coutume de Bretagne only granted this right to private personages who were noble. As a matter of general right, it is very certain that the seigneur haute justicier had alone the right of erecting mills throughout every part of his jurisdiction. No one was entitled to erect barriers for the protection of his property without the permission of the judges of the seigneur. Fontaines. Putes. Routoirs. Etangs. The rain-water that fell upon the high roads belonged exclusively to the seigneurs Hautes Justiciers, they alone were enabled to dispose of it. The seigneur haute justicier possessed the right of constructing ponds in any part throughout his jurisdiction, and even upon lands in the possession of those who resided under it, upon the condition of paying them the price of the ground put under water. Private individuals were only able to make ponds upon their own soil, and, even for this, many coutumes required that permission should be obtained of the seigneur. The coutumes, however, thus requiring the acquiescence of the seigneur, established that it is to be given gratuitously. La pêche. The right of fishing on navigable or floatable rivers belonged only to the king, and he alone could make grants of this right. The royal judges alone had the right of judging offences against the right of fishery. There were many seigneurs, however, who exercised the right of fishing in these streams, but they either possessed by concession made by the king, or had usurped it. No person could fish, even with the rod, in non-navigable rivers without permission from the seigneur haute justicier within whose limits they flowed. A judgment, dated April 30, 1749, condemns a fisherman in a similar case. Even the seigneurs themselves, however, were obliged, in fishing, to observe the general regulations respecting fisheries. The seigneur haut justicier was enabled to give the right of fishing in his river to tenants in fief, or ascens. Le chasse. The right of the chase was not allowed to be farmed out like that of fishing. It was a personal right, arising from the consideration that it belonged to the king, and that the nobles themselves could not exercise it, in the interior of their own jurisdiction, without the permission of the king. This doctrine was established in an ordinance of 1669, par. 30. The judges of the seigneur had the power of taking cognizance of all offences against the rights of the chase, except in cases appertaining to bet rouses, signifying, it would appear, what were generally called grosses bet, stags, does, and which were considered royal. The right of shooting and hunting was more interdicted to the non-noble than any other. The fief of the non-noble did not even bestow it. The king never granted it in his own hunt. So closely observed was this principle, and so rigorous was the right considered, that the seigneur was not allowed to give any permission to hunt. But still it did constantly occur that seigneurs granted such permissions not only to nobles but to non-nobles. The seigneur haut justicier possessed the faculty of hunting and shooting on any part of his own jurisdiction, but alone. He was allowed to make regulations and establish prohibitions upon matters appertaining to the chase throughout its extent. Every seigneur de fief, although not having the feudal power of judicial courts, was allowed to hunt and shoot in any part of his fief. Nobles who possessed neither fief nor jurisdiction were allowed to do so upon the lands belonging to them in the immediate neighborhood of their dwelling houses. It was decided that the non-noble possessing a park upon the territory of a seigneur haut justicier was obliged to leave it open for the diversion of the lord. But this judgment was given as long ago as 1668. Guerennes. Rabbit warrens could not be established without title right. Non-nobles, as well as nobles, were allowed to have rabbit warrens, but the nobles alone were allowed to keep ferrets. Colombiers. Certain coutumes only give the right of colombiers à pied, dovecot standing apart from a building, to the seigneurs haut justiciers, others grant it to all holders of fiefs. In Dauphiny, Brittany, and Normandy, no non-noble was allowed to possess dovecot, pigeon house, or aviary, the nobles alone were allowed to keep pigeons. The penalties pronounced against those who killed the pigeons were extremely severe, the most afflictive punishments were sometimes bestowed. Such, according to the authors above cited, were the principal feudal rights still exercised and dues still levied in the second half of the 18th century. The rights here mentioned, they add, are those generally established at the present time. But there are still very many others, less known and less widely practiced, which only occur in certain coutumes, or only in certain seigneuries, in virtue of peculiar titles. These rarer and more restricted feudal rights, of which our authors thus make mention, and which they enumerate, amount to the number of 99. And the greater part of them are directly prejudicial to agriculture, inasmuch as they give the seigneurs certain rights over the harvests, or tolls upon the sale or transport of grain, fruit, provisions, and our authors say that most of these feudal rights were out of use in their day. I have reason to believe, however, that a great number of these dues were still levied, in some places, in 1789. After having studied, among the writers on feudal rights in the 18th century, the principal feudal rights still exercised, I was desirous of finding out what was their importance in the eyes of their contemporaries. At least as regarded the fortunes of those who levied them and those who had to pay them. Rinaldin, one of the authors I have mentioned, gives us an insight into this matter, by laying before us the rules that legal men had to follow in their valuation of the different feudal rights which still existed in 1765, that is to say, 24 years before the Revolution. According to this law writer, the rules to be observed on these matters were as follow. Droits de justice. Some of our coutumes, he says, estimate the value of justice haute, basse, or moyenne at 1/10 of the revenues of the land. At that time the seigneurial jurisdiction was considered of great importance. Edme de Fremonville opines that, at the present day, the right of jurisdiction ought not to be valued at more than 1/20 of the revenues of the land. And I consider this valuation still too large. Droits honorifiques. However inestimable these rights may be considered, declares our author, a man of a practical turn of mind, and not easily led away by appearances. It would be prudent on the part of those who make valuations to fix them at a very moderate price. Corvées Seigneuriales. Our author, in giving the rules for the estimation of the value of forced labor, proves that the right of enforcing it was still to be met with sometimes. He values the day's work of an ox at 20 sous, and that of the laborer at 5 sous, with his food. A tolerably good indication of the price of wages paid in 1765 may be gathered from this. Pages. Respecting the valuation of the tolls, our author says, there is not one of the seigneurial rights that ought to be estimated lower than the tolls. They are very precarious. The repairs of the roads and bridges, the most useful to the commerce of the country, being now maintained by the king and the provinces, many of the tolls become useless nowadays, and they are suppressed more and more every day. Droit de pêche et de chasse. The right of fishing may be farmed out, and may thus give occasion for valuation. The right of the chase is purely personal, and cannot be farmed out. It may consequently be reckoned among the honorary rights but not among the profitable rights, and cannot, therefore, be comprehended in any valuation. Our author then mentions more particularly the rights of Banalite, Banvin, Lade, and Blairy, and thus proves that these rights were those most frequently exercised at that time, and that they maintained the greatest importance. He adds, there is a quantity of other seigneurial rights, which may still be met with from time to time, but which it would be too long and indeed impossible to make mention of here. But intelligent appraisers will find sufficient rules, in the examples we have already given, for the estimation of those rights of which we do not speak. Estimation du cens. The greater number of the coutumes place the estimation of the cens, au denier 3 1/3%. The high valuation of the cens arises from the fact that it represents at the same time all such remunerative casualties as the laudes et ventes, for instance. Dimes in fiades. Terrage. The tithes and fief cannot be estimated at less than 4%, this sort of property calling neither for care, culture, nor expense. When the terrage or champart includes laudes et ventes, that is to say, when the lands subject to these dues cannot be sold without paying for the right of exchange to the seigneur, who has the right of tenure in capite, the valuation must be raised to 3 1/3%. If not, it must be estimated like the tithes. Les rentes foncières, which produced no laudes et ventes or droit de retenue, that is to say, which are not seigneurial revenue, ought to be estimated at 5%. Estimate of the different hereditary estates existing in France before the Revolution. We recognize in France, says this writer, only 3 kinds of estates. 1. The franc aliu. This was a freehold estate, exempt from every kind of burden, and subject neither to seigneurial duties nor dues, either profitable or honorary. There were both noble and non-noble francs aliu. The noble franc aliu had its right of jurisdiction or fiefs dependent on it, or lands paying quit rents. It followed all the observances of feudal law in subdivision. The non-noble franc aliu had neither jurisdiction, nor fief, nor censive, and was heritable according to the laws affecting non-nobles. The author looks upon the holders of francs aliu as alone possessing complete property in the land. Valuation of estates in franc aliu. They were valued the highest of all. The coutumes of Auvergne and Burgundy put the valuation of them as high as 40 years' purchase. Our author opines that their valuation at 30 years' purchase would be exact. It must be observed that all non-noble francs aliu placed within the limits of a seigneurial jurisdiction were subject to this jurisdiction. They were not in any dependence of vassalage to the seigneur, but owed submission to a jurisdiction which had the position of that of the courts of the state. 2. The second kind was that of estates held in fief. 3. The third was that of estates held on quit rents, or, in the law language of the time, rochers. Valuation of an estate held in fief. The valuation was less, according as the feudal burdens on it were greater. 1. In the parts of the country where written law was observed, and in many of the coutumes, the fiefs lay only under the obligation of what was called la bouche et les mains, that is to say, that of doing homage. 2. In other coutumes the fiefs, besides the obligation of la bouche et les mains, were what was called de danger, as in Burgundy, and were subject to the comise, or feudal resumption. In case the holder of the property should take possession without having rendered submission or homage. 3. Other coutumes, again, as in that of Paris and many others, subject the fiefs not only to the obligation of doing homage, but to the racket, the quint, and the requint. 4. By other coutumes, also, such as that of Poitou and a few others, they were subjected to chamberlainage dues, the cheval de service, and of these 4 all estates of the first category were valued more highly than the others. The coutume of Paris laid their valuation at 20 years' purchase, which is looked upon by our author as tolerably correct. Valuation of estates en roture and en censive. In order to come to a proper valuation, these lands have to be divided into 3 classes. 1. Estates held simply on quit rents. 2. Those which, beside the quit rent, are subject to other kinds of feudal servitude. 3. Those held in mortmain, à taille réelle, en bordelage. Only the first and second of these 3 forms of non-noble property were common in the 18th century, the third was extremely rare. The valuations to be made of them, according to our author, were less on coming down to the second class, and still less on coming down to the third. Men in possession of estates of the third class were not even, strictly speaking, their owners, inasmuch as they were not able to alienate them without permission from the seigneur. Le Terrier. The feudistes, whom we have cited above, point out the following rules observed in the compilation or renewal of the seigneurial registers, called terriers, mention of which has been made in many parts of the work. The terrier was a single register, in which were recorded all the titles proving the rights appertaining to the seigneury, whether in property or in honorary, real, personal, or mixed rights. All the declarations of the payers of the cens, the usages of the seigneury, the leases aux cens, and were inserted in it. We learn by our authors that, in the coutume of Paris, the seigneurs were permitted to renew their registers every 30 years at the expense of their censitaires. They add, however, it may be considered a very fortunate circumstance. Nevertheless, when a new one may be found once a century. The terrier could not be renewed, it was a vexatious business for all the persons dependent on the seigneury, without obtaining either from the Grande Chancellerie, if in cases of seigneuries situated within the jurisdiction of different parliaments, or of the parliaments, in the contrary case, an authorization which was denominated lettre à terrier. The notary who drew them up was nominated by the judicial authorities. All the vassals, noble or non-noble, the payers of the cens, holders of long leases, amphityotes, and personages subject to the jurisdiction of the seigneury were bound to appear before this notary. A plan of the seigneury had to be annexed to the terrier. Besides the terrier, the seigneury was provided with other registers, called leaves, in which the seigneurs or their farmers inscribed the sums received in payment of the cens, with the names of those who paid and the dates of the receipts.